opening chair while he's getting his construction done. So with that, as before we get started, does anyone, Senator Wassenberger, do you have any introductory comments or anything you'd like to say before we launch into the testimony? Jeff, do you have any opening comments?
You know, I do. I know that there is a great deal of experience on this committee, like Senator Bevout and others, and we have studied this issue many times in years past. And so there's all kinds of information and material on it. Many times in the past, there have been attempts to address the issues that we're going to face. But, and so I would just say to the committee, we need to do the best we can, and that's all we can do. So at the end of the day, we have two shots at it. I think that with the general session coming up, we need to have some proposed legislation of some kind. And then ultimately the committee continues into 2021. And then of course you have a 2/3 vote to be introduced in both sides of the House. So those are issues you need to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We have some great educators who are going to present to us today, and we might as well get on with it. And so I wish us all the best of luck.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And yeah, just from the standpoint of the House, I think it's not unrealistic to presume that the community colleges budgets, both in terms of capital construction and into the block grant or the direct state funded components, will be substantially reduced over the next coming biennium and thereafter. And so that will necessitate us taking a deeper dive into funding sources, into consolidation, into how and where we administer and the governance of community colleges. It's something that is not going to be necessarily all rosy, but we're gonna need as much help as we can possibly have from the colleges and the presidents and the counties to work together as a team to come up with a way to determine exactly what the structure of community colleges will be going forward, and what our communities are willing to expend in order to maintain what we have and moving forward. So it will be a fairly long and arduous task, I believe, before we land. But we have short-term funding issues, we have medium-term funding issues, and long-term funding issues. And so as we walk through all this, those will start to gel out, and we'll have a better understanding as time moves forward. But I agree, we've got a great group around us. Everyone loves our community colleges. We want to do the best we can for them. But we have to live within our means, and it's just going to be a product of how we get there. So with that, I want to remind everybody that we're on the legislative website, that we're live. Anyone that wants to participate and read the materials that we have are available on the legislative website. So you can go into the website, pull it up, and you'll be able to walk through the documents that we will be presented to us today and summarized. Most of today is more of an educational session, and so we're going to get a lot of background information. We're going to walk through those materials, and if for everyone that once we get started, please keep your computer on mute so that we don't have background noises and everyone can hear the speaker. And if you have questions, we'll kind of do the raise the hand, and we'll have the LSO staff then we'll recognize you and bring you back in, and be sure to unmute then, and then go back to mute when your question is concluded. Now, before that, any of the members like to have any introductory comments? Go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair and Co-Chairman Senator Wasserberger. Good morning, everybody. As I was looking at our report that LSO prepared for, and by the way, they did a great job on that one, Michael. And thinking back how community colleges over the years have been so important to our state, and you look at the funding levels and what's happened, and we had House Bill 80 several years ago that Representative Greer carried, and we put that in place. But you look at the funding levels of our other K through 12, and particularly in the university, and how the community college were treated. The thought that entered my mind is I think that maybe we have to take a better, harder look at how we treat our community colleges. And Bob, you said it so well, we all love our local community colleges, but they've been sort of like a stepchild that's been left out of a lot of it. And I remember when we did the cuts in 2016-17, in community colleges, there were actually a lot of pink slips. So I just say that to say that I'm looking forward to working on this committee, and hopefully when we're done with this, we'll have some good, strong funding mechanism in place to continue the role of community colleges for our state. They're so important. Thank you for allowing me to say a few things, Bob.
You bet. Thank you, Eli. Anybody else? Okay. Representative Freeman, go ahead.
Thank you. And I just to add a little bit of history to it. I served on the board of trustees for 6 years before I came into the House 10 years ago. So I've been dealing with governance and funding for community colleges for a long time. And to kind of emphasize some of the stuff that Senator Bebout said is that we keep on adding on to the responsibilities of the community colleges, and we haven't added on to the funding. And we really do have to look at what kind of model that we want. I like the local control. I like the competition between the community colleges. They compete for funding, they compete for students, and they compete about each other for excellence. So I hope we don't forget that, because I think that that's one of the things that makes Wyoming's community colleges so strong.
Okay, anybody else? And I guess the next stage, we need to take a roll call before we get started. Anna?
Senator Osalmi Dalton.
Present.
Senator Bebout.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
He's excused.
Senator Landon.
Excused.
Here.
Representative Freeman.
Here.
Representative Greer.
He's excused. He'll be here shortly.
Representative Northrup.
I'm here.
Representative Walters.
Here.
Co-Chairman Wasserberger.
Here.
Co-Chairman Nicholas.
Here. Okay, Anna, what's next on the agenda? First.
Mr. Chairman, I believe Michael's going to get on and do a little introduction on the select committee and then go into his white paper.
Okay. Michael, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Wasserberger, I wanted to start by doing a quick introduction of the topic summary for the committee. My name is Michael Swank. I'm a senior fiscal analyst with the Legislative Service Office. And before I get into that, I did want to express gratitude and appreciation for the Community College Commission staff and the colleges for kind of helping supply a lot of documents and helping with the summary materials in advance of this meeting. All the materials, I also wanted to remind you, all the materials are on the website, and they have also been added to the committee's library that we started about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So as we accumulate information for this committee, it will be added to that library. So it'll be in kind of one convenient location. The first item to kind of go over is the select committee's summary or topic summary that was basically the summary of the motion made in Management Council on August 16th to form the select committee. The topic summary is handout 2-01 in the committee materials if you wish to pull it up. And the brief summary I'd like to make is first, the select committee is basically kind of a accumulation of two committees' requests to study the community colleges. First was JAC, which was their priority number 5 topic of their 8 topics they submitted to Management Council. And the focus was intended to be fairly comprehensive, funding and governance, kind of the standard broad-based language used in that topic, with an emphasis on trying to figure out best practices and where efficiencies could be made within the system. I did want to know add that as a staffer to the Joint Appropriations Committee out of the Budget Fiscal section of LSO, I believe, and I'll also defer to the chairman and then JAC co-chairman Bebout if they would like to add. Part of this stems from a $30 million request that was made by the community colleges in a letter to the governor in November. This was after the commission's budget had been passed to the governor for recommendation, and it encompassed what was kind of termed trying to catch up the community college budgets based on prior budget cuts, inflationary factors, and increased demands that community colleges expressed were placed on their institutions. Since that letter was not within the official budget request of the governor, JAC did not specifically provide an action for that to the legislature. However, the budget bill was amended in, I believe it's section 333, to add $5 million from the strategic investments and projects account to be utilized as matching funds for the colleges so that they could utilize it as they saw fit. So it wasn't a matching funds for construction or anything specific. It was very it was up to the discretion of the colleges. The other thing is that during the budget hearings, the Joint Appropriations Committee put the commission and the colleges on notice that the JAC would be submitting this topic and that the JAC would welcome the commission and the colleges to start assembling some information for that intended interim request. As I'm not a staff member of the Joint Education Committee, I can't provide as much background, but the Joint Education Committee submitted a request to study the colleges. It was their priority number 3 of their 5 topic submissions. And their emphasis was post-secondary governance. So it was supposed to include the community colleges and the University of Wyoming. Based on forming the select committee, Management Council's decision, the Joint Education Committee was more or less scaled back to just the University of Wyoming governance, with one clause in their topic to coordinate with the select committee on whatever the select committee chooses to study or the elements of the study. The University of Wyoming governance study was intended as part of section 337 of the budget bill. It requested the Legislative Service Office to contract for that study. However, I believe Management Council at their last meeting chose to postpone an RFP and contracting for that study until after the 2021 general session. So that's kind of the broad-based background to where Management Council decided to set up the select committee. The select committee's charge, as shown in that charge or a topic summary document, is intended for the select committee to be a 2-year committee to do a comprehensive review of governance, funding, programs, and I believe the chairman kind of stated a lot of the intentions, looking at programs, whether it's consolidation, long-term, short-term funding, those types of things. And the review should include looking at the goals, objectives of the system, purposes. I'm not sure if it's intended to revisit the mission of the colleges and the commission, and how the system should be prioritized. And I guess lastly, it would be kind of continued communication interactions between the K-12 system and the university. That is kind of a short and sweet summary, hopefully short enough. And there is a requirement for the committee to report to the management council, although it does not have any specifics as to what to report to the management council, whether it's legislative recommendations or other types of information. But I just wanted to note that the report would be due on or before November 1st of this year. I'm happy to take questions.
Questions for Michael? So I might note that for those of you who don't know, Campbell County has submitted an application to create its own district. And so I think just because of where they are and how they're doing it, it will be likely that this committee will look at that process and whether that process is appropriate. And so that issue may come before this committee as well, at least for some types of recommendations, just so people know. Go ahead, Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Michael, can you help me remember, having sat on all three of the committees that wherein this has risen to the level that we sit at today, I'm trying to remember on the joint education charge, and maybe Chairman Northrup can help on this, what we ended up with and what the Joint Education Committee may be headed toward by November. And will that route through the Management Council as well as the work of this select committee? Or Michael, can you shed a little light on where did we wind up with on an agenda for the Joint Education Committee?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, if I understand your question, my understanding is that the Joint Education Committee received a kind of a short summary and briefing on overall post-secondary education governance at their June meeting. I did reach out to the LSF staff prior to this meeting to check to see if there was any intention of the Education Committee's next meeting in September to include any aspects or need for a summary from this committee. And they said that it is not currently deemed an agenda item for the September meeting. I do not know where the Education Committee charge with respect to this committee was really, I think, the language is used, it says coordinate. So I'm not sure exactly how far that goes into what they wish to receive from this committee, or whether the Joint Education Committee would be the committee to which the Select Committee would offer recommendations. Since this committee is authorized by the Management Council, I believe the intention is to report directly to Management Council any information that it deems necessary prior to the next session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Michael, this committee, all we can do is recommend. We cannot actually draft or sponsor any legislation. Is that not correct?
It's cold out today.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I'm sorry. I might defer to Anna on that. I don't believe the intention was that this committee sponsor direct legislation, but I'll let Anna add to that.
Mr. Chairman, I believe the committee can draft legislation and then recommend it to probably Management Council, but they could also potentially ask Management Council if they'd rather the Select Committee refer it to Education or Joint Appropriations, depending on the subject matter.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, Michael, please proceed. Oh, wait 1 second. Senator Wassenberger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just a quick update on the situation at Gillette College. Since I moved to, you know what, I'm gonna pass on that. I've got some background noise, and so I'll talk about that.
Okay. Okay, Michael, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next I guess part of the agenda is to go, I wanted to briefly summarize the white paper provided to the committee. As many of you know, kind of a new policy or a new approach to committee staffing over the last few years has been to provide at the first meeting of a committee some background information to kind of set a baseline of information. So the white paper you have is handout 4-01 on the website. And this really is a legislative side view of the colleges in the system. I didn't get into any of the information directly from the colleges. It's really a statutory and summary of the past studies of the legislature. This white paper was provided in draft to the College Commission staff. They provided some feedback, and I believe they have a full understanding of what is in the white paper. Last thing I'll note is that this really is kind of a baseline information. It's not meant to be all inclusive of everything. If there are some questions of detail or nuance, I might defer those to the commission staff when they provide their summary materials subsequent to this white paper. In getting into a little more detail of the white paper, page 1, you'll find kind of the listing of the colleges and when they started. It shows that no new college district has been formed in over 50 years since 1968 with Laramie County Community College. The commission started in 1951 and it has always been called the commission, but its charge, its membership, its duties has kind of greatly evolved and changed over time. If you look, I provided the original 7 duties from the 1951 Act. And then if you compare that to table 1, a few pages further, you can see the vast kind of expansion and detail provided on the 6 different functions of the commission, how they interact with the colleges, the university, how they kind of manage and coordinate the system. They are typically referred to as a coordinating entity, while there are some, I guess what I would call quasi-regulatory roles in there, developing rules, kind of helping institute standards and so forth. The colleges themselves each college has its own board of trustees. They kind of do the day-to-day management of those colleges, oversee the budgets, the programs, that sort of thing, and then continually interact with the commission to make sure the system is implemented in a coordinated and cross-institutional fashion. In terms of the funding of the system, I believe page 9 provides the table 2, which is basically kind of a snapshot of what the appropriations were in fiscal year 2009-2010 at the end of the last time the legislature did a comprehensive review. So if you recall in Appendix B, which I'll summarize separately, there was 3 years of study by the legislature. Well, initially the Blue Ribbon Commission by the governor, which interacted with the Joint Education Committee, and then 2 interims of the Community College Planning Task Force. So right at the end of that, I try to provide what the budget looked like for the commission and the colleges for state funding. And then I provided the most recent biennium, which does not actually account for the expected budget cuts to be released by the governor, hopefully before the Joint Appropriations Committee next week. I did want to note—
Mr. Co-Chair?
Please.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, if I could ask Michael a question, and as we look at, our overall education in our state, not only K through 12, but community college, university, I think it'd be helpful, Michael, if we could look at, so we get apples to apples and look at, and pick, you could pick 9, 10 like you've done here to the current, or you can go back to like what we had the other day on, I looked at some K-12 and university stuff that we've seen, went back to 99, 2000. So at least we could see a perspective of number of enrollees, number of FTEs we had at our community colleges. And what I'd like to see, Michael, is 99, 2000, 2009, 10 and current, and then see our enrollment FTEs in the community colleges, then the amount of money we spent, not only local revenues, but state aid. And then fast forward, and we already have that, I think, for K through 12 and for the university, just so I could see at a global perspective, if you will, the amount of money that's gone there and how it's been treated over this 20-year cycle and a 10-year cycle. And then specifically also about capital construction, where I think This might be on the next slide, where the state aid to community colleges in the last decade was a couple $100 million, which is not insignificant. It was huge, but the local commitment by the different communities that stepped up, and then look at the amount of money. Of course, K through 12, we spent about $3 billion, just to get a perspective of that overall look of all education in our state. Would that be doable, Michael?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, I believe that would be something that we can prepare for the next meeting.
And Michael, what we'll do is towards the end of the day, or perhaps next week, we'll put that together, what that request will be, and we'll circulate it to make sure that everyone has a chance to chime in on it. Because I think we're going to want to know what tuitions were and how tuitions have raised. We're going to want to know what the mill levies for each district is. We're going to want to know in what contributions for those counties that are within a district that have voluntarily, for satellite offices, how much they've individually contributed over time, and the breakdown of students across districts. So we know who's attending what schools and how many folks are, for example, in Lander versus Riverton, and Cheyenne versus Albany County, and all that information we're going to want, and over both a spectrum of time in terms of direct funding, and also I would think we're going to want to know salaries of the instructors and your adjuncts and the staff. So all of those things are going to have to be, I think, laid out so we have a full and comprehensive picture of where we've been, where we are, and where we think we can head. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me get back to my note here. So Senator Bebout touched on the second table in there that shows the community college capital construction for the last few years, table 3. The last couple items I wanted to highlight was first the summary of the previous studies. What I try to do is basically encapsulate 400 pages of studies for the last 35 years provided to the legislature. If you look on pages 12 and 13 of the white paper, there's a summary of some of the issues, the questions, the concerns the legislature has brought to, or that different committees have brought back to the legislature and tried to implement changes over time. So, short and kind of in a short order here, there's your typical, the larger concerns usually concern governance and funding adequacy and equity. And then there are other areas which I know today might be touched on, including service areas versus district boundaries, which gets into both representation of service area counties within the districts, as well as how service area counties may or may not be contributing as much resources to the community college district. Cross-institutional relationships, both before students get to college in the K-12 system, as well as potential transition or transition to the university and so forth. Academic standards, consistency, transferability. We discussed capital facilities, which has been much more prevalent in the last 20 to 25 years. And then the last 2 items, programming mission initiatives and planning, as well as enrollments, completions, and performance, has been a strong emphasis in the last 20 years or so, particularly with the Community College Planning Task Force in 2008, 2009. That one of the results of that was a very comprehensive strategic plan for the system, as well as a movement towards performance-based funding, which I believe was partly implemented with House Bill 80 in 2016. A couple of recent developments, which is the segue to the next section, recent 2016, the state aid recalibration changes that were initiated by House Bill 80. I believe the commission has a handout that kind of discusses this in a little more detail, both initial implementation as well as where it stands, particularly with respect to recent budget cuts. And then in 2019, 2 other significant legislative initiatives, including the Wyoming Works program, which was funded and has been gradually implemented by the colleges, and then the Bachelor's of Applied Science degrees. And I believe the commission has continued to get updated information on how these initiatives are moving forward. I'm going to skip over Appendix A, which is kind of just a elaboration of each biennium's budgets for the commission, and go to Appendix B. This, as I said, was an attempt to try to summarize 400 pages of studies, recommendations, as well as provides this committee what the legislature did coming out of these studies. What were their initiatives? What did the legislature try to amend or initiate after those studies? From the 1984 study, that's kind of the first large study, which was a sunset review from the Management Audit Committee. Now, prior to the current processes of the Management Audit Committee, in the early 80s, the Management Audit Committee conducted sunset reviews based on legislative direction. It provided basically to substantiate programs' continued funding and existence. Typically, programs were provided sunset dates, and prior to that expiration, they would get information on whether that program was actually doing what it was intended to do and whether it was meeting its intended goals. So, in short, the 1984 evaluation kind of concluded that the system was meeting its goals, but may not be meeting them in an efficient and effective manner. It concluded that if the commission was sunsetted and disbanded, that the colleges and the public would suffer for a lack of coordination. So the commission was extended. Obviously, it continues to today. The results of that study in 1985, the legislature passed, I believe it was a couple bills, but the main bill initiated the current 7 commission membership. Prior to that, the commission had a variety of memberships that included primarily education personnel. There were at some point, upwards of 15 to 20 members on the commission. So in 1985, they kind of set the standard for the current 7 commission configuration. They required the commission to develop rules, which started to provide more state level oversight and to back up the state's interest for the significant financial contribution of state appropriations, and then required, I believe at the time there was either a pending application or an initiated application out of Campbell County for a new district. That district, the legislation specified that any petition that was filed by September 1 of 1980, or all district formation petitions had to be acted upon by the commission by September 1st of 1985. I believe there was a denial of a district application for Campbell County in the late 80s, which I believe did go through the court system, but I will wait potentially to discuss that at a later time. In 1990, the Management Audit Committee again did a contract audit, and this was interesting in that it was done right on the heels of the broad government reorganization from 1988 to 1990. There was a recommendation in the Ferrari reports of the reorganization that thought it would be better to have a Board of Regents system in the state, which would more or less be a state level governing body for all post-secondary education, but that was not initiated. So after this 1990 study, the committee or the legislature implemented additional requirements of the commission, and specifically in the legislation that followed, actually approved a definition or a mission statement for the commission. I believe that's on page 6 of the Appendix B if you wanted to review that in a little more detail. So there was statutory, or I should say session law direction on what the commission's purpose and the college's purpose would be. In 1999, there was another study over governance. I believe the study more or less focused on governance and how it kind of impacted different aspects of the system, whether it was funding, whether it was program review and approval, data systems and reporting, that sort of thing. And the recommendation was basically for the legislature to answer several broad questions to define the purpose and focus of the system, and then set the governance and funding accordingly. So out of the 2000 session, the legislature initiated the 6 function focus of the commission. So if you look through statute, and I believe it's shown in table 1 of the white paper, all those statutory functions underneath the commission. I believe there's general functions, implementation, coordinating, reporting, those functions. And then it also, interestingly enough, required the approval of the legislature before any district can be formed. I believe this was an amendment during the bill on the floor, so I'm not sure there's a lot of background as to why the legislature chose to put this in. However, there has been a long-standing clause in statute that requires the legislature to approve funding to the district. So there was, in a sense, a role for the legislature to approve districts and their use of funding before this provision. And I guess finally, I kind of lump in the Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission of 2007, and then the Community College Planning Task Force of the legislature in 2008, 2009. There were kind of 3 successive study periods. And out of that, there's a variety of things that came out of it. One is the very broad-based strategic plan, which I believe was updated again in 2014 and is going through another updating with the commission this year. It provided what is essentially the current capital construction process, including prioritizations of projects and utilization of the prior construction management division and now the state construction department, and coordinating that. And then also started to look beyond enrollment for funding allocation and try to begin to look at fixed versus variable costs in the allocation of state aid to colleges. I believe that's kind of the gist of Appendix B, and I'm ready to take any questions you may have.
Questions? Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael, you mentioned looking at a board of regents and some of that analysis. I believe that might have had to do with the Ferrari report. And I might even have been on that committee that looked at that. I can't remember, but it seems to me we had a lot of discussion about governance of post-secondary education in our state. It might be helpful, if that's where that came from, to pull that out. And at the end of the day, what co-chairman Nicholas was talking about, some good information. That might be some good information as to the discussion we had, some of the testimony, why that was a good idea or not a good idea to have a board of regents. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll consider that. And I do believe you are correct. You were on the Management Audit Committee. Well, during the 1990 study.
And in any of these studies that we've seen out there, Michael, I didn't come across comparisons of how other community colleges are funded in terms of state dollars versus a community funding, and how many of them have worked through the mill levy process versus some other form of funding that's and then on how many are statewide governance versus more of a county or a community or a district governance. Have you come across so many detailed information about those concepts?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the Community College Sustainable Funding Work Group did receive some of that information in a June 3rd meeting. I believe those presentations are in the library. I have not gone through them in more detail, but I do know the Joint Education Committee did receive a briefing report that we can provide access to this committee as well on post-secondary education governance, more broadly speaking. My understanding, we were going to go in a little more of that detail at our next meeting, but I did not go into detail for this white paper.
Sure, I just want to, once we open the door, it's just the more educated we are, the better, more well-rounded we can be. So, for other questions for Michael on his white paper. Okay, Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is really not a question, Mr. Chairman, but just a comment to Michael. Thank you for all your work in pulling together information that has been gathered over the last 30 to 40 years. I just found it fascinating. I would comment, first of all, it's interesting that way back in the early 80s, we requested that the Community College Commission help us to avoid duplication. I found that kind of interesting. And then, beyond that, just several things along the road that have been added to that particular state agency and what we've asked out of it. Along with the chairman, I'm quite interested in what other states do, and it's all over the map. Some of my post-secondary studies included taking a look at community colleges across the country, even to the state to the south. They're very central in their administration of their colleges down there. I would say that my reaction to it was, I'm not sure in a college down in that state, the green state, that you can buy a ream of paper without going through Denver. So I think it would be interesting to compare and contrast. But thank you for all your work on that, Michael. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, thank you for that. The only thing I will add, and this might be something that the commission staff can add on to at a later time. I did attend the June 3rd meeting for the Sustainable Funding Work Group, and where they had members of WICHE and I believe SHIO, which I can't remember the exact or what the acronym exactly stand for. But what they did provide was an interesting perspective that through the last 35 years in the studies of the legislature, one of the most consistent things has been the continued focus on maintaining the commission. I'm not saying that to provide any sort of valuation or opinion judgment, but it's interesting to have had all these studies and that there's been a consistent desire to maintain the commission and to maintain the local government board of trustees relationship. As Senator Landon notes, there has been concern over time, whether it's duplication, different concerns about where different powers lay within the system, whether it's at the state level or the local level. But there seems to have been a conscious effort to continue that relationship between the state and local level without taking significant control away from the local level.
Go ahead, Representative Freeman.
The idea of duplication has been a big issue for the 16 years I've been involved in this case. And I understand it because we don't want to set up expensive programs where they're not needed. But for example, welding is needed all over the state. And I can't remember what community college finally responded to that need within their local districts. And there was some pushback that, well, we already have welding programs in this place and that place and so on and so forth. And but that community needed it. And the local governance was able to promote that and to go forward with that. So we have to be very careful about duplication because the state needs nurses all over the state. They need welders. And those programs are going to be in each one of the community colleges. Do we need a wind program in each one of the community college? I would think not. But one of the things that I think that has to happen with community colleges is there's got to be more collaboration. For example, on wind technology, most of that's electricity. And most of the community colleges that have any kind of CTE program can do the basics all the way up to where they start to go up into the tower and deal with specifics like that. I don't know why all community colleges are not working with LCCC who has that program to get students up to a certain point to where that they can go to LCCC and finish that. And that's what I think is some of the things that we need to do in this committee is promote, encourage, incentivize that kind of cooperation. And I think you'll get some effectiveness on that. Local control in my mind is very important, but the other thing is we have to remember that students that attend community colleges usually are non-traditional students, and they're not gonna sell their house. They're not gonna to sidetrack their career for 2 years to go to a community college somewhere else in the state to go forward. It's a different animal than what you have with a university program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Thanks for your comments. Other comments? Okay. Michael, what's next? Or Anna? Oh, I see on our agenda that we've interspersed kind of public comment in between presentations. And with regards to who we have, we've got Sandy, we've got Joe, you folks, anytime, for example, if you'd like to comment now as part of the public comment as we go forward, I know that it's kind of awkward on how we do this. And so I want to make sure that we kind of tally up and you don't have to cover everything at once, at one time. So go ahead, Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael, a question for you. In the white paper on page 18, I believe it is, of Appendix B, it discusses on capital construction that projects over $1 million require legislative approval or authorization. And then earlier in the document, and I don't have that page off the top of my head, it says it's $1.5 million. So I think it was 2009, 8 or 9 legislation increased that from $350,000 to $1 million. But then when was the legislation created that moved it up from $1 million to $1.5 million for that authorization? Or am I misreading the two different authorizations needed? But I believe they're both capital construction related.
Yeah, I think we did that a couple of years ago, Tom.
Thank you. I just missed it.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't notice the difference, but let me go back and check.
Sandy, you're muted, but you're shaking your head yes. Okay. Okay, any comments from the community colleges, the commission, before we move on to our next topic? I don't hear anything. I don't see any rapid action. Brad, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. I was prepared to comment at each of these 3 phases where my name is listed, but you did suggest that maybe it might be more apropos to kind of intersperse things along the way. So I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture that kind of goes along with the conversation to kind of enhance it, if hopefully. And so there was several things stated about the college, and I did want to point out one thing that's important to recognize, and I think we all know this, but it's a good reminder, is that it's probably safe to say that at CWC anyhow, that probably 60% of our operation is, the 4 credit, transfer certificates and degrees, but there's a whole lot that we do more so than that. So I just kind of reminder that kind of as centers of economic development and culture, that there is that piece there. And so I wanted just to put quickly some numbers to that. So it's very easy for us to talk about, FTE and enrollments and cost per FTE and how can we do things more efficiently, which is great. But it seems to me that's about 60% of our operation. So at CWC, I would just want to remind people in terms of non-academic events last year, we do these reports to our local board. And I very much love the comments from Representative Freeman about local control. But so non-academic events at CWC, we had 3,905. This is rotaries and clubs and whatnot. We had, in terms of people, 94,767. We keep track. This is to report to our local board, like how are we serving beyond just credit. So that's about 100,000 people, about 4,000 events. And then there's non-credit classes, which there's community enrichment, like as learn guitar. And then there's professional development for non-credit, like learn a spreadsheet. And so we had 168 of those classes. And so how that compares to our credit operation is we offered 680 for-credit classes. And so 168 non-credit, 100,000 people there for non-academic things whatsoever, 4,000 events. And in addition to that, of course, we do all these pre-college things that we have to remember. The Centers for GED when people need high school diplomas. And ESL, English as a Second Language, very big thing in Teton County. And then there's all this pre-college work too. You have to realize that we have this whole section of this building that does Gear Up, Talent Search, Upward Bound. And so we have, and these are, pre-college. So Gear Up is 7th grade to 12th grade. So we're out there, right? In these schools, 7th grade, it's 275 Gear Up students. And then there's Talent Search, which is 6th grade to 12th grade, and that's 507 students. And Upward Bound is 9th grade to 12th grade. And these are different you're nurturing students for college of different demographics. So there's about 1,000 students there total. Of course, we're big in concurrent enrollment. Kind of paint the picture too, is there's a lot of complexity in our systems. For example, our complexity is we serve the reservation. So we have a memorandum of understanding with the tribes where we actually share costs and revenue for that operation because they are sovereign nations, right? So there's things that have been set up which are really good but complicated. And there's a whole variety of things. There's the athletics events is more than just for the students. It's when we have a basketball game, a lot of people show up and it's a cultural event. We have 1,000-seat theater and we only got about a dozen theater students, which is great because there's not a lot of theater jobs in the world. But the point of 1,000-foot theater is it's a community center. And then lastly, I think an important part of our mission too is the economic development. And so we have business and industry training, which is non-credit. We have 318 clients. And so when we really serve them through grants for new businesses, and then they have a type of grant from the state for existing businesses. The college has a business park. And so we have lots of people. We have High Mountain Jerky, High Mountain spices on our business park. We've had economic commission through the Community College Commission. We've had economic impact studies that shows the millions of dollars of impacts we have on our community through economic development. And then we also, of course, have access to big grants. So in terms of the Economic Development Administration, for example, our college has received $3 million recently. And I know the other colleges have received similar big dollar values. In the pipeline is another $12 million to try to really push a lot of things in our economy. We commissioned studies, economic analyses, what types of industries we need to push. Currently, our college is pushing kind of the meats development regionally and within the state. So I just say all of this just as a reminder that as we sometimes get tunnel vision on, how many credit students do we have and can they take it online and can they move to Laramie? We have to remember that we're so much more in terms of our operation. And in terms of our students, I think it was Representative Freeman who pointed out that the students are truly, most of them, for us certainly, are place-bound. We have 67% of our students are part-time, ages 26 to 40. They have mortgages, they have payments. 38% of them are just getting certificates. They're not going to move anywhere for just a certificate. And so truly place-bound is the way we need to think about our students, and technologically challenged. Largely, that's just because last mile internet connectivity. I think our towns do pretty well, Riverton, for example, Jackson, but if you get out of town a mile or so, forget it. And so sometimes I hear propositions about, oh, they could take online or they could move to Laramie, going, no, they can't. These are not baby face students in some Hollywood movie. So I just wanted to provide that information just to kind of enhance the conversation. And I also want to say I agree with Representative Freeman that there is more collaboration that we could definitely do. We have a long list, I'm prepared to read it to you, of things that we've collaborated on and saved a bunch of money, but I think we can do a whole lot more. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me this time to speak.
You bet. Thank you very much. Sandy, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Select Committee, I had 2 points that I wanted to make sure that I brought forward. Mr. Chairman, it's whether or not you want me to address those right now or if you want to later in the discussion. The 30 million request that Mr. Swank mentioned earlier, I have some information in detail about how that came about. I know it's very well understood around the letter that came forward, but there was actually a conversation. The presidents didn't do that without discussion, and we needed clarification of a process, and we've actually received that. I could talk about that. And then also the concept of the ability for the colleges to work together, and particularly a provision that was allowed for through Wyoming Works with a consortia. So those are 2 things that I think are really important for at kind of a level set for people to understand, for the members of the committee to understand as you continue your deliberation. So if you would like for me to just bring up those 2, I'm happy to do so, or I could wait until a later time in the agenda.
Yeah, I think we can wait on that. On the first component, most of us understand the $30 million request, and I don't think it's germane, really. And it won't make any difference on where we're going and what we're doing. But I understand that the need to respond. I think perhaps Michael's explanation was probably placed a little bit more emphasis on it than what was the cause of JAC looking for to review governance. There was just more an overall need to re-examine and rebalance and to face what we see as impending fiscal crisis, which through the COVID thing basically got exponentialized in the course of 3 short months. But on the latter one, I think we'd like to go into that, but I don't think we need to do it at this time, Sandy. So I see your Representative Greer's getting back online to join us. So Michael, I think now we're going to the current college governance, and tell us how we're going to proceed with that.
Do I need my time, Mr. Chairman? I have it.
If you have it, that's good.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that the next section is really up to the College Commission and the college presenters. It's their information, and we will coordinate as we need to.
Okay, College Commission, tell us how you'd like to proceed.
Mr. Chairman, we know that this committee may, go in different directions, so we're prepared to take that in a variety of directions. I think I can talk about the governance topic from the, just sort of from the high level. We did provide an overview of the commission, much of which Michael actually did cover in his white paper very thoroughly. What I will share is that our June 3rd meeting, we did with the sustainable funding work group that we were tasked with creating, and did do so. We did have WICHE, which is the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, which is provided in the Wyoming statute, and then also SHEO, which is the State Higher Education Executive Officers that work with a state level post-secondary education for all 50 of the states and territories, actually. So they had the level of expertise to provide and combine information really on at the state level basis for how post-secondary institutions and governance works within states, and then actually provided pretty substantial information that had been gathered and studied by ECS, which is the Education Commission of the States, who had just released a comprehensive governance study. The information, I believe Michael said, is provided to this select committee in its library. I just know there's a lot of information. So what I will quickly do is just highlight the different primary types of post-secondary governance that you see across the states and the territories. And this information is available in a presentation. And I think potentially having Witchy discuss that so that it provides a neutral voice might be helpful, as Michael discussed in potentially the next meeting. In general, there's two types of levels that occur in the four different components of governance structure. There are either the consolidated education or the not consolidated education. And that can be done regardless of whether or not you have a regent, a coordinating body, an agency, or an uncoordinated. And so if there's a consolidated, there are primarily two types that occur in a consolidated. One that is all education, K-12 through post-secondary. And frankly, in some of those cases, they also include workforce in that. And there are states that are examples of that. And then, so that's the one type, the consolidated for all education. And then there's the consolidated for higher ed, which would then have all post-secondary. So it would have universities and community colleges. Primarily occurs in states where there are multiple universities, including regional. And our state does not have regional universities, and the community colleges actually serve as both community colleges and regional higher education centers. And that was a point that ECS and Witchy made sure to bring up, that our community colleges in this state serve more than what a traditional comprehensive community college is in other states, primarily due to our population base and the very large service areas. And actually that's in the 1999 study, which by the way is still a very good document that you had done. Then within actual coordinating or structured governance structures within states, there is what is called a board of regents or a statewide governance board that may or may not be within the consolidated. Sometimes you have that for all higher ed, and sometimes you have that for just the universities, and sometimes you have that just for the community colleges because their missions are so different. Typically, when you do have a board of regents or a governing board, they do tend to have then sub-entities that work on the university components, and then a staff or support that works on the community colleges and or technical colleges if a state has those. And then, so that's kind of the state level model. If you have a governing board that works on a very, very macro level, those tend to not have local boards, which then creates challenges on the ability to pass bonds and those types of things for passage of local elections. Then you have coordinating boards, and those work in, that's what our structure is. It is a coordinating body. In some states that works for all higher ed, and in some it separates the universities and the community colleges, given their structures are different. And if it is one combined consolidating coordinating body, and I'll give an example of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, they then separate into the university and the two university systems, and then the community colleges, and then manage that almost as two functions within the larger coordinating board. Ours is that structure, and you can see that it has evolved over time so that there is a balance of the states interest to make sure the dollars are going, and the regulatory effort is there to ensure that the dollars that are funded by the state go as they are intended. But then the local boards administer that, and that in fact keeps our agency very, very small in having them facilitate that work. And then you have an agency structure where in some states where they may or may not have boards, but then it is managed through an agency where there isn't a coordinating type of board that is either appointed or in some variation of a coordinating body. And you have a few states that are like that. Not many. Coordinating and regents are by far the most prevalent. And then you also have what are called uncoordinated systems or states. And I would say New Mexico would be an example of that. And it creates quite different funding mechanisms and actually delivery of statewide education throughout the state. So those are kind of the primary structures, and we do have quite a substantial set of documents for you to review that. And I would say again, maybe Witchy being able to discuss that. They just did a comprehensive study for both New Mexico and I'm looking to see if Michael might remember this. And I believe they also did a comparison of Montana and Alaska that had quite a bit of challenges when they tried to completely consolidate their system. So that would be, Mr. Chairman, the topic of governance. I can go into more. I think if you want to talk about our particular state, we are a coordinating body, and I think all of the efforts of the last 35 years that Mr. Swank talked about has led us to this point where we're able to work on the ability to do the things that are within the commission purview, and then really rely on the colleges to work on the local level, their advisory committees, the program planning, and making sure that they're able to be responsive and adaptable at the local level. The colleges all have things that they need to deliver upon that impact the state. How they need to apply it might vary from college to college.
Questions for Sandy? Okay, seeing none. Please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the next topic is on the college funding, and I am going to turn this over to our CFO, Mr. Larry Buckles. He will step you through that. Again, I think Michael did yeoman service on pulling together all of the summary of how we've gotten to where we are on the funding mechanisms that we have, the ability to distribute the funds that we do receive equitably out to the colleges, how that is combined with the state aid, which is not quite actually 60% of the college budgets, but also with the local revenue, and then how that comes together with tuition. I think you all know the Community College Commission does set the tuition. We do a tuition workshop every other year to study that in depth, including comparisons and how that impacts the overall college budgets. But also there is the elasticity of demand that occurs when you do a change in tuition. What New Mexico found is when they changed it as much as $5, they actually had a drop in overall enrollment. And so the increase actually turned out to be a net loss for the colleges. And that is something that we always have to be very mindful of, is what the elasticity of demand, and it's a very high topic for the colleges. So I'm going to have Mr. Buckles go through that. One thing I do want to share is we struggled, the commission, on how do we make additional requests around things like external cost adjustment, inflationary pressure that isn't provided for in recalibration. I mean, I think House Bill 80 is really quite unique in how it allows for distribution and recalibration, but it doesn't allow for the inflationary pressure. We did seek an AG informal opinion on that, and we did, or guidance on that, and that is actually public information, that we are not able to put that in as a formal exception request. We would have to do that as a separate request to the governor to see if he would put that in his budget. So it's a little bit of just the way the statutes are written doesn't allow us as a commission to do that. It doesn't prohibit us from asking, but it does prohibit us from making that a formal exception request. And it would have to be the governor who would add that into our budget. And with that, I'd like to turn that over to Mr. Buckles and let him wow you with the excitement of how the funding works together.
Thank you.
Okay. Any questions before we go on? Okay. Larry, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go over the slide deck that is part of your attachment 5-03. It's a high-level overview of the funding allocation model. So I'll just point that out right off the bat here. The commission doesn't have a true funding model. We have an allocation model that distributes the funding based on the appropriations that the legislature gives to the commission in the form of state aid to the colleges. So, you know, as part of the background to how and what all of that funding is, you've heard this a couple times already this morning. State aid makes up approximately 60% of the funding for the operational side of college operations. Another 20% is made up from local revenue in the form of property taxes, and another 20% is made up from tuition and fees. Of that tuition and fee pot of money, the tuition portion of it is set by the commission for all 7 colleges, so the tuition rate is the same at each of the institutions. The college boards have the authority to set their own fees. So they do that. We've got that specific detail if this committee is interested in that. So we can share all of that, both what it is today and then on a historical basis too, as you've already indicated, is something that you want, Mr. Chairman. So we can provide all that to Mr. Swank.
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Greer, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I have the full context here. We talked about 60% state aid for operations. Now that excludes insurance, retirement, and major maintenance. Am I understanding this correct? So there's additional state aid in those 3 buckets, or is that included when you talk about 60% of all operations?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Greer, it does exclude from the funding allocation model and the way that the money is distributed, it does exclude the line item appropriation for health insurance for college employees. It excludes the increased retirement contributions over the base of 11.25%. It excludes major maintenance. It excludes any capital construction appropriations.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so let's take construction out of the picture. That's one-time dollars. But what is the state aid when you factor in those other 3 items: the major maintenance, retirement over the 11%, 11.5%? What's that? Take that up? 80, 75, 80%?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Greer, I don't have that right off the top of my head. We can certainly do some calculations and provide that back to the committee.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, I just think as we look how we're going to afford everything in the state of Wyoming, it would be good to know exactly what that percentage is, what those total dollars are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And if that number has changed over time, on each of those components and how they have changed over time in terms of percentage and pure dollar amounts. I think we need to see a chronological history as well as a hard number. And by the way, as we go through this, the other thing that we're going to want to learn and get feedback from the colleges is, okay, so let's assume that it's actually 70% or 74%. And let's assume that that may be, that there's going to be a 20% cut in that by action of the legislature in the next 2 or 3 years. How, I think it'll be, we will want to know how the commission intends to implement those cuts. If it's just going to be across the board on the same distribution model, or are you going to allocate or direct each community college district and the presidents to determine how they're going to make those types of changes or cuts to, within the districts, and then help us understand what those real impacts will be to the communities and to the districts as they happen or before they happen, so that we, once again, we have the biggest picture possible of what the ramifications are of the budget cuts. And, and if it's 74% is state funded, then we have to make the determination at some point how much of that's going to be locally controlled versus commission controlled versus legislative controlled. But until we have the full picture, I think it'll be more, it's harder for us to do that in a reasonable fashion. And frankly, we need to understand what you intend to do and how you implement it for us to be either reactionary versus, more guiding to help you on a soft landing and to help us with our constituents and what we think the core missions are of the community colleges. So I think all of those components are going to all be mixed into the same review as we move forward. Senator Landon.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just to pick up on some of the things that you pointed to, it would really be helpful for me, Larry, if we could get a better idea of what it takes in terms of outreach and how that plays into the formula that you use to fund the colleges. I'm particularly interested in light of the fact that we talk about local taxes, but that local taxation really only occurs in those 6 or 7 college districts, if I understand that correctly. Given that, how do we go about, is it all state funded when we reach into places like Teton County or Carbon or Converse? I don't want to pick on any of those sites specifically, just we have several of them around the state, and I'm just curious, what's the funding interplay and how does that work when we make choices to reach into other communities out there? How do our colleges go about funding those? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, please proceed, Larry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the next slide in the slide deck again is a high-level overview of what we do with that, with the state aid portion of the allocation within that allocation model. So of the pot of money that is provided by you to the colleges for state aid, 60% of that is taken right off the top and distributed to colleges for their fixed costs. So this is where we depict the different sides of the funding allocation model and the fixed and variable sides, like Mr. Swank talked about in his white paper, and how this model was adopted as a result of a previous committee, previous legislative committee work. So we take 60% right off the top and distribute that to the colleges based on their fixed costs. Every 4 years, the fixed and variable cost is recalibrated at each one of the colleges. So, so we distribute it based on that recalibration, and it stays right at that 60% the same 60% level of what their fixed costs are versus their variable costs.
So could
The
you,
other,
Larry, could you define, well, two things. First of all, if you would like this to be pulled up on the screen, so to accommodate folks as you walk through it, Anna or whomever at LSO, they can pull this up and you can walk through it. I've got it open in a different block, so I'm kind of following it as you talk. But then could you define what fixed cost is and how that is calculated? Is it on a square footage basis? Is it on a, just where does it come from? And that's set, I see that that's set by your rules, but could you explain that?
yes, Mr. Chairman, and it is defined in our rules. It's in Chapter 5 on page 5-2. And what it says is fixed costs are mandatory transfers and those operating costs that do not vary with enrollment. Such costs include the majority of administrative costs as well as operating costs related to facilities, utilities, maintenance, small repairs. Fixed costs include all or a substantial portion of costs classified as plant operations and maintenance, institutional support, academic support, and student services. Also included in fixed costs is a relatively smaller portion of instructional costs, representing costs for academic administrators, faculty, and other related operating costs. Variable cost definition, again, as defined in the rules of the administrative rules of the commission, are those operating costs that vary proportionally with enrollment and represent step variable costs. Step variable costs increase and decrease based on enrollment fluctuations, but not necessarily proportionally. Instead, step variable costs remain static for a range of enrollments and increase once the range is exceeded. The step variable costs remain static across the range until the next level of enrollment is reached. Variable costs include all or a substantial portion of operating costs classified as instruction service and student financial aid. So those are the basic definitions of what we consider the fixed and variable cost side of the funding allocation model.
Questions on that? So I think it'll be useful, obviously, as we move forward, Larry, to see how those fixed costs are allocated through the various districts, and then also how that has increased over time. I mean, is it formulaic? Is it, I mean, once you have established a fixed cost, is that the baseline that goes up and down? How are they comparable on a population basis, on a square footage basis, on a administrative personnel basis? Do you do an analysis of whether or not the number of administrators per student or per educator and how those fluctuate between the colleges? There's just lots of interesting things about that I think would be useful to know.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we can do that. And just to give you a little bit more background, when we recalibrate fixed and variable costs across the system, we do it based on actual expenditures out of the college's accounting systems. So it does vary. Again, we do it every 4 years. So we take the previous 4 years, we separate out their actual expenditures for the fixed definitions and the variable definitions, and then recalibrate that on their actual, based on their actuals.
And so that suggests to me, just by definition, that as much as you can spend and define within your fixed costs, the more likely that you'll continue to receive that sum or an increased amount if you add additional components to it. Is that a fair statement?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would not say quite, because I mean, the costs do go up at the colleges. Utility costs go up, everything goes up. However, the cost for the fixed side of the calculation never fits into the recalibration of the base period for funding from the legislature and how that appropriation is created. That, I guess, is a bit of a segue for me to say the fixed costs do not have a built-in ECA. The fixed cost increases at the colleges do not ever come forward in a funding request within the state aid block grant to the legislature. There's no mechanism for that. The recalibration is all done on the enrollment side. So it's still a fixed pot of money. It's just how much of that pot of money is attributed to fixed cost versus variable cost.
Mr. Chairman?
Please, Representative McGurk.
Yeah, so, someone said earlier, as a committee had worked on this in 2016 or 15, the summer of. Well, the committee didn't do anything. House Bill 80 was my bill. And what was said was absolutely correct, is we, rather than the commission coming in and requesting an exception request every year, we were looking for something that would move automatically. And Don Richards has all the calculations for that. So we go back to Don, but that was right. We took a base year on those fixed costs. There is no inflation built into it. What was asked for at that point in time was that we made the adjustment based upon enrollment. And that was the whole discussion during that summer. And the discussion, as this bill was advocated for, was that we had an adjustment based upon enrollment. And that was the driving factor on this.
Senator Bebout.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And when you look at the 60% of what Mike's talking about, that's exactly the way that works. And that formula is based on enrollment, that's 60%. But what happens, the 20% for the 4 mills in different districts raise different amounts of money. And then the other 20% are which the tuition, which is set by the commission, but fees are set by the local board. So there's an inconsistency there that some colleges may be able, because of the formula levy, get more money and some colleges less. And I don't know how you ever reconcile that to see those differences. The other thing, Mr. Co-Chair, I'm going to have to sign off for another Energy Council meeting, but I'll be back as soon as I can. Thank you.
Okay, appreciate it, Senator. Sandy, go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I wanted to provide one clarification on the administrative costs that Mr. Buckles just alluded to. There is a distinction of the administrative costs in the fixed and the variable costs, and that is tied to the requirements that institutions have for specific positions, regardless of size, versus the number of positions they might have in an area that would vary due to total enrollment. And I'll give you a couple of specific examples to help clarify when an administrative position would be in fixed costs and when they would be in variable costs. And I'm very familiar with this because I was actually at one of the colleges when we were creating what was the fixed costs and what were variable costs. I worked at Western at the time. And so I was part of the group that worked on that. The difference has to do with what is required and what then becomes a scalable amount. Every accredited institution is required to have a chief executive officer, which the state in statute has defined as the chief administrative officer. You have to have that. That's a fixed cost, and you can't not have it. You're required to have a chief business officer. You cannot get around that. The same is true for a financial aid director, or somebody that oversees the federal compliance component of Title IV funding and financial aid. Every institution, regardless of size, has to have that position. However, how many support staff they have to help run that area, for example, financial aid, would then begin to scale depending on the total student head count and the number of students that had to be processed. So there would be an example of a few positions that you can't get around it. They are fixed costs to where there are some then how large that operation might need to be would then become a variable cost calculation. And they were very conscientious whenever they created which ones were going to be fixed and which ones were going to be variable. And the colleges and the commission worked together to coordinate how that was going to look. So then when Mr. Buckles is talking about what they pull in for the actual, it was based on the determining factor. So I don't want it to appear that just all administrative are covered under fixed cost. That was very thoughtfully and conscientiously determined based on the components that are required versus the components that are going to be scaled based on enrollment.
Great, thank you. That helps. Any Senator Wassenberger?
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And I just wanted to mention that the college that I'm most familiar with, Gillette College, has local funding. It receives about $1 million from the city of Gillette, $1 million from the county commissioners, and the BOCES, the Board of Cooperative Higher Education Services, it receives almost $2 million. So there is a large amount of local funding out there, at least for Gillette College. I don't know about the other colleges, but that's how we fund Gillette College.
Well, and to follow up on that, Michael, I think at some point, all of these fiscal requests that we're talking about and how much money the college has received, we're going to want that broken down by district and by college. So for example, my understanding is that for Sheridan College, they maintain a certain amount of dollars that goes over to Gillette College and a certain amount they keep for administrative. So we want to know what those differences are. For Laramie Community College, it would be interesting to know how much of the total dollars they receive go to Albany County and how much Albany County may or may not contribute and how much, their costs and overheads are within a district. And we have that same issue in Fremont County, Lander versus Riverton and then with the add in Teton County, how it's going to be allocated and how it's distributed. We've got Douglas and Torrington. And I think at some point we need to know all those numbers broken down on a more microscopic level for us to have a full understanding of how our funding model works and how it trickles down or it doesn't trickle down throughout the system. And that will probably also need that on a capital construction basis as well, because those are often done differently. And we know that the counties typically in some locations fund those better than other counties do. So once again, it's understanding the whole picture for us to do anything that other than just say, we're just gonna cut money and you're gonna have to find another way to raise it. So any comments on that? So go ahead, Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Sandy, I appreciate your thoughts today. And I would ask a favor. I tell you what, I think I can hold it for a little bit later. I was going to bring up something that might be more appropriate a little later in the day. So thank you. I'll hold off.
Well, we're all going to wait with bated breath to figure out what that favor is. Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments? Larry, go ahead. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the other 40% is distributed to the colleges for the variable side of the cost of the funding allocation model. That 40% is divided into two different pots. Half of it is distributed to the colleges based on their enrollment for each weighted credit hour. The other 50% of that 40% is divided in half. So 25% of the total is provided to the colleges on their proportional share of successfully completed weighted credit hours. And the other 25% is distributed proportionally to the colleges for their conference of high degree certificates and degrees. So that is where we have implemented the performance metrics that Mr. Swank talked about when he gave you the overview from that white paper and previous studies from the legislature. Um, a little bit of background, as you know, and as Representative Greer has already stated.
One second. Sorry to interrupt, Larry. Senator Wassenberger, go ahead.
So just a quick question. Is that what those are off of performance indicators? And is that what's called the 4P? Yeah. Okay. All right. I got you. So what are the 4Ps?
Mr. Chairman, let me give this one let me see how good my memory is working this morning. Progress, persistence, placement, and participation. I take my vitamins. I will, however, Mr. Chairman, Senator Wasserberger, say that the performance metric for placement is not in place. We don't have yet the ability to be able to cross state lines and get UI data to be able to ascertain what graduates are working across in other states. We can do it for the state of Wyoming, but that does not lend itself to an equitable solution to implement that performance metric.
Okay, and so just to follow up to make sure I have this right, 4Ps are progress, persistence, placement, and participation. And I believe that comes from, 2 year, a bill, I can't remember the number. So do I have that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Wasserberger, yes, you have it correct. And those are delineated in the 2014 Commission statewide strategic plan. It's an addendum to the original that was undertaken in 2010.
So before I forget, Michael and Sandy, could, as part of our fiscal profile and analysis, hopefully, and you may already have it, but I'd like to get a breakdown of the costs and overhead of the commission. So for staffing, and have a picture of that over time. So just a general understanding of how often you meet, what you do, and then the costs of operations for the commission itself. Okay. Great, thanks. All right, Larry, once again, sorry we keep interrupting you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next slide gives you a little bit more background and what the commission did with regard to funding prior to House Bill 80 in 2016. And just as a high level overview, it was written into statute that the commission would come back to the legislature every year and ask for an adjustment to its base funding based on enrollment, compared to what enrollment was in 2003, 2004. Actually, the slide says 2004, 2005. So if our enrollment was above that, we asked for an exception request based on that additional load at the colleges. That was the real genesis for House Bill 80 and what Representative Greer sponsored that session. The desire was to create more of a sustainable look at funding for the community colleges, because every single session we were coming back for an exception request. In very few of those cases was that exception request totally funded. As a matter of fact, I think it's somewhere around the 70% level that we actually received what we asked for. So the colleges had no real way to plan their next academic year because, number one, we were always lagging a little bit on the actual enrollment compared to the base in a legislative session and an exception request versus what the colleges had on their campus. So House Bill 80 and its recalibration of the base period, what that allowed us to do is to be able to give the colleges a baseline of what their funding was going to be over a 4-year period, 2 biennia. And that's 4 budget cycles for the colleges because they budget annually. So it did that. It took care of that concern. So that's what happened. Also included in House Bill 80 is, you heard me say that the distribution of the variable side of costs, the variable side of funding is distributed based on a college's enrollment by weighted credit hour, successfully completed weighted credit hour. So each credit hour is assigned a value. For instance, an online course is weighted at 0.8. A regular lecture course is weighted at 0.1. A lab course is weighted at 1.25, and a high intensity, a high degree of equipment, low enrollment, controlled class sizes, those are a level 3, and they are weighted at a 0.15. So the funding allocation model in its basic mechanism is it takes the amount of state aid and it takes the amount of local revenue, and it creates a revenue per credit hour. And that revenue per credit hour is then factored by those 4 levels of instruction of what the colleges actually deliver. And that's the internal mechanisms within the funding allocation model and how that distribution proportionally happens across the system.
Larry,
So-
I'm going to that on the slide talking about 70% of the requests were actually funded. Is that 70% of all requests? Does that include CapCon, or is that just operations?
No, Mr. Chairman, that is just the exception requests that were submitted to support that enrollment growth
Okay.
over the base period.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, you know, we've talked a little bit already about House Bill 80 and what it does. And I think that, you know, I've pretty much covered what's on that next slide. It provides that stability in funding so that the colleges have a better mechanism and a better outlook to know how they can plan their budgets. The appropriation for state aid for 1920 was exactly the same as 21-22. So it functioned the way that it was supposed to. We recalibrated the base the very first time prior to the 2019 session. So it was implemented and used as the standard budget in the 2019-2020 budget, and it carried over to this one. We will recalibrate again in the spring of 21, and that will adjust the standard budget in the 22 session for the 23-24 budget.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Larry, this is a good spot, I think, to come to what I was going to ask of Director Caldwell and yourself. Can you help remind us all of, during that transitional period, I remember in 2016 sitting on appropriations and hearing that transition left some things behind, and that there was a lag, which has created in the minds of some colleges a gap or an unfunded situation that we have not essentially caught back up to. Can you do me a favor, either get back to me on that, or if you can answer it today, and maybe you intend to as we work through House Bill 80, that would help me to remember what that situation was. Thank you.
Mr.
I'm sorry, Sandy, you got your finger up?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and Larry will probably be able to answer this better than I can. That lag period has to do with when the enrollment is actually conducted and when that happens and when the colleges actually receive the funding, because that's based on what the historical amount was. College, whenever their enrollment is there, they respond. They meet those students where they are, and that increased cost happens right then. Versus when the recalibration can happen, or even an exception request would occur. I remember this from 15 years ago, even. There's always a lag between when the colleges actually have the students and when we can report what that was. It's just a nature of being able to balance based on the past on preparing to move forward. So that is certainly a very significant aspect, and it's always a challenge for the colleges to navigate. Mr. Chairman, I have an answer for you on the percentage of the total commission budget that is related to the actual agency itself. And we will get that for you on a historical basis. We did put that in our State of the Agency report, and that's why I knew I had it off the top of my head somewhere. Out of our 257 million budget, which now will be reduced, 5.9 million of that, or 2.4%, is agency, of which 3 million of that is related to the computing system or the ERPs for the colleges. Once you net that back out, the actual agency is about 1.1% of the total budget. We will do a comparison for you over time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Any other questions while we're moving along? Okay, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next slide in the slide deck provides some background or it provides some narrative on the challenges that were created by House Bill 80. And those challenges, prior to House Bill 80, we had a different weighting on the credit hours that the colleges delivered based on that level of instruction. We had just 3. A lecture course was a 1, a lab course was a 1.5, and a high intensity, low enrollment was a 1.5. And House Bill 80 lowered those. So what that did is it decreased the amount of variable cost funding that the colleges get for those that deliver more of a level 2 or a level 3 course, because it wasn't worth as much money. And previous to House Bill 80, all online courses were a level 1, and they decreased to a level 0.8. So it created some challenges within the allocation, in that, courses that had a high number of, shall we say, industry type driven courses versus typical, now I'm missing my term here, but just a normal lecture course, an academic course. There was a little bit of an inequity there, and the colleges had to absorb that. And we're moving past it. We have distributed now, with that recalibration, the 3rd time. So this is our 3rd fiscal year within the 4-year biennium that we have distributed money to the colleges based on that type of an allocation. Another thing that it did, because of the way that House Bill 80 was implemented, the first recalibration of the base required us to compare enrollment over the academic years 13, 14, and 15 versus 15, 16, and 17. So one academic year was on both sides of the recalibration. The next time we recalibrate, we will recalibrate using 15, 16, 17 versus 18, 19, and 20. There is no duplication in there, and that's the way it's supposed to be. But I say that just because I want you to be aware that the spring semester of 2020, when COVID-19 hit, that will be in the recalibration of the next time of when we recalibrate in the spring of 2021. I think that you will hear from the presidents that they haven't been impacted all that much. A lot of them maintained their enrollment and retained their completion. So it's anticipated maybe it doesn't have that much of an impact. So I just wanted to make that an awareness issue for you all, just so that you know that, you know, the impact of COVID-19 on the colleges will be reflected, will possibly be reflected in the recalibration of the base period the next time we do it. The next slide talks about, you know, things that are not addressed in House Bill 80, and we've touched on these already. There is no ECA built into the funding allocation model, and there is no ECA built into our statutes, unlike, you know, what K-12 has and how they do their true funding model. So that's something that is still, you know, of concern. And in more ways than one, like you saw during the session and has already been talked about, was partially the genesis for that $30 million request by the presidents this spring. And as the slide says, and as the Joint Appropriations Committee heard, just simply based on inflation, the colleges are about $58 million behind. On the fixed side of things, utilities, like we've talked about, utilities have gone up, other costs have gone up. Those administrative costs that Dr. Caldwell talked about, salaries have gone up. I mean, it's just keeping pace with things. And the way that funding for the community colleges works right now, it's not addressed. So it's something for this committee and for future joint appropriations committees to consider. Because we will work, I think we will work to try to address how some of that may work, and where that funding comes from is still a decision to be made. But regardless, it probably needs to come in through the funding allocation model to make sure it's distributed equitably. Also, you know, Mr. Swank brought up what has changed at the colleges over the course of the last couple of years through actions by the legislature. One of those is the Bachelor of Applied Science degrees. Each college is authorized to stand up 2 of these bachelor degree programs. And when this was talked about in the session, and there was concerns about how much it will cost to stand up these programs, and it was said that it won't cost the state of Wyoming anything to stand up these Bachelor's of Applied Science programs. And that's true. The credits delivered as a result of having these programs will go into the funding allocation model. They will go into the enrollment calculations. There are not, as we speak, a different level of instruction or a different funding level for credits delivered in those courses, even though they are 3,000 and 4,000 level courses, and they cost more to deliver. But there is nothing within the funding allocation model or the recalibration of the funding allocation model to address those higher costs. They're still at a level 1, 1.25 or 1.5. So just to make that point and make it clear for all of you that the credits delivered will come into the enrollment, and the enrollment drives the recalibration. So those credit hours delivered will be included in that. The next slide is Wyoming Works, and Wyoming Works will work exactly the same way on the credit side. You authorized Wyoming Works tuition assistance or financial aid to be given to students in both credit and non-credit coursework. And the colleges are delivering that financial aid as we speak, as students enroll in programs that were specifically approved by the commission to be authorized for Wyoming Works delivery. So those credit hours also will come into the enrollment. The 4 credit hours will come into the recalibration effort that we do next year. So I just wanted to make that clear, and that's the impact of both the BAS program and Wyoming Works on funding for the community colleges.
Larry, on the Wyoming Works component, my recollection was that it comes into the model, but it's separately identified so that we can parallel track how much it is and what those classes are and how much their direct costs are. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we provide a report that shows how many students enrolled, the courses that they enrolled in, and how much was expended. The money for tuition assistance is a separate appropriation outside of the funding allocation model. And we report that to the Joint Appropriations Committee and Joint Education Committee. And I think Joint Labor too.
Okay, any questions? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Larry, really appreciate your rundown of House Bill 80. That helps me to remember some of the issues related to inflationary costs, and I believe it involved insurance, and we've tried to deal with that over the last 3 or 4 years, but thank you for that. I think that answered my earlier question pretty well. I was just curious regarding any structure that you might recommend regarding an ECA. Would you see that? I think on the K through 12 side, I don't recall the exact language in statute, but we are to consider an ECA, which goes through the Joint Education Committee and on to the Appropriations Committee as a recommendation one way or the other from both of those committees and then to the legislature. Would you see that as happening the same way? And the second piece of my question relates to how does your formula increase? Is it only on that instructional side? Did I understand that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, on the first part of your question, I can't say that I've given it a lot of thought. I've spent time watching the Joint Education Committee and the discussions around the ECA that comes up every time they talk about the funding model for K-12, and I see them sometimes as being a little contentious, and there's a little bit of pushback on how much that ECA costs. So I don't know enough about how it works in the background on the K-12 funding model to know if that would be a proposal on how to address an ECA in the future for the community colleges. It is certainly something we would look at, but again, we would also look to our partners at both WICHE and SHEO and get a perspective of how that happens in other higher ed systems. So I think we could formulate probably some alternatives if it was desire of this committee or Education Committee or Appropriations Committee to see a proposal. I think we could come up with some alternatives and be able to do that. As for your second question, yes, the funding allocate the basis for a calculation for the state aid appropriation is driven solely on participation, one of those P's, which is enrollment at the community colleges. That is the only thing that increases and has the potential to decrease the state aid appropriation.
Thank you for that, Larry. Appreciate it.
Senator Wassenberger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I noticed that your 60% of fixed costs is based on student enrollment. And I was wondering if we have information on how many students are dual enrollment and how many students are concurrent enrollment at each of the 7 community colleges. And if that information is available and how that funding for dual enrollment and concurrent enrollment is done in the state of Wyoming.
Who wants to respond to that? Sandy, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Wasserberger, we do have information regarding the enrollment for dual and concurrent, and I believe under the next section, Dr. Ben Moretz is going to talk about programming, enrollment, consortia, collaborations, in the next section. He has been working very diligently on gathering better information around dual and concurrent. And if we if we could defer this topic until we get to that section, I think it will help.
Senator Anselmi-Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Larry, I'm pretty new to all this. I'm not on education or things like that. So I was looking at Wyoming Works, and I see that, I know it was House Bill 78, and they allocated $5 million, $3 million for student grants, but it's only up in Gillette and Sheridan. And I know it does nursing programs, and I'm just trying to figure out, are we trying to expand that? Is it something, why isn't Western Wyoming Community College or the other colleges participating in it? I just wanted to be more familiar. I apologize that I'm not familiar with that, how that worked out.
Did you want me to take that, Dr. Caldwell,
or Sandy?
I would take that one, Mr. Chairman and Senator Anselmi-Dalton. Wyoming Works, all 7 of the colleges are participating very heavily in Wyoming Works. So I just want to be very, very clear on that. All 7 of the colleges are very active in it. There was programmatic funding that was a specific application process for the colleges to go through. The funding that we receive for Wyoming Works was separated, as you just mentioned, student grants, and then into programmatic funding. And then we did an application process on that, in which the colleges, the first round, actually exhausted that funding. And I believe, right off the top of my head, and Central Wyoming College was one of the leads, Laramie County Community College. We actually have consortiums in that. And again, Dr. Moretz is going to talk about that. Northwest and Eastern participated in that one with the CDL. And then I believe it was the MEETS program for Central Wyoming College that also had Eastern and Northern in that. So all 7 of the colleges do participate in Wyoming Works. Nursing is not, the registered nursing programs are not a part of Wyoming Works. And that is because we already had the WIN funding and programmatic funding for those students to participate in the nursing program. So the opportunity was to take the Wyoming Works and really focus on those programs that were aligned with the economic sectors that the state of Wyoming had identified and codified. And then those that through the ONAT Bright Outlook would have a high wage potential. So we were very careful in putting those rules in place to allow for that. But all 7 of the colleges participate in Wyoming Works.
Okay, please proceed. Well, let's see, it's 10:37. This is probably a good time. Let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at 10:47. All right. So Sandy, before we get started, why don't you just remind us where we are in our schedule and what we're going to anticipate for the rest of the morning?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. I believe Mr. Buckles is going to wrap up. I am going to cover the commission priorities, and then next is going to be Dr. Moretz, and he's going to talk about the programming, courses, enrollments, and really that big picture of the direction of the programs for the colleges. I believe Kyle Moore is on to talk about their role in doing concurrent, and actually our really big work around the student transfer success and what we've been doing with the Common Course numbering. I think that takes us through the morning, and I'm sure Drs. Tyndall and Schaefer will have some examples of what that means at the local and individual colleges.
Okay, well, with that, Larry, please proceed and wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a second and address what Senator Bebout brought up earlier in my presentation, and that being the aspect of local revenue and how it differs, it's different, obviously, across the 7 community college districts that charge 4 mills for local revenue that the colleges get. We do recapture and redistribute state aid based on the actual collections that the colleges get in their local revenue. So we use an estimate of their local revenue combined with their state aid to create a revenue per credit hour, and we distribute money based on their actual delivery of those credit courses at the weighted credit hour ranking. At the end of each fiscal year, we adjust, or we recapture and redistribute state aid based on their actual 4 mil revenue to equalize the cost per credit hour and to equalize and ensure that each college gets what they've earned in the delivery of the credit hours that they have delivered. So there is no inequity, even though the collections are different at each of the 7 counties. It's very similar to what K-12 does. So we recapture that and then redistribute based on actual collections of that revenue. So just as another high level example, Sweetwater County, quite a large sum of 4 mil revenue for Western Wyoming Community College. They get a small proportion of state aid because their local revenue is so high. But at the end of the day, they're getting the same revenue for the delivery of the credit hours that they have sent out the door, if you will. So that equalizes that local revenue across the system. The college keeps it. We redistribute state aid.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, that's what I wanted to hear and understand that better. The other thing, though, that on that, Larry, is the fees that we charge, and colleges may do it differently, but in the big scheme of things, they provide those services, so it's probably not a factor, correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, no, it's not a factor. I just would like to take a minute here to address the differences in student fees. There is a mandatory student fee that is charged to a student by credit hour, and then there are course fees. We track at the state level what those mandatory student fees are that each college charges, and we include it in their revenue for reporting purposes. But so those types of fees are, a wireless internet infrastructure fee, a fitness center fee, there's probably 24 different categories of what the colleges charge for these fees. But we track that so that we know how that matches up with tuition. Course fees, on the other hand, are fees that are charged for consumables to deliver a certain type of instruction. So you pay a course fee to take a welding course so that the college recoups the cost of welding rods, plate, maintenance of equipment, those types of things. And that's something completely different. And that again is set at each institution, but those types of fees are also controlled by HLC. So they have to meet a standard and they can't exceed a certain amount. So there's two different types of fees. Course fees we never talk about. They're not something that's tracked, and they're not something that we keep our arms around. And just for the record, mandatory student fees, those fees that are charged equivalent to the number of credit hours that a student enrolls for, are very, very similar across the system. They probably range from the $39 to the $50 credit hour range across the 7 colleges. So with that, I know that Dr. Caldwell wants to do some other thing, but the next 2 items in your handouts relate to the money side of things. I don't know if you want to do that, since that's where our brains are right now, or if you want to go to back to Dr. Caldwell to talk about college priorities.
Yeah, I think we could, let's go on to those. And just to follow up on the recapture of state aid, so I understand that. So with the use of state aid, basically you fund those community colleges that do not have sufficient mill revenues to cover what you as a commission has assigned to be your per credit hour payment. Is that a fair statement?
How about if I was, Mr. Chairman, if I was to say this in a way that is, every community college gets revenue equivalent to 0.8% of a revenue per credit hour, a 1% of, or a value of 1 for every weighted credit hour, 1.25 and 1.5. Every college gets that amount of money for every weighted credit hour that they deliver. Part of that cost is their local revenue, and or part of their income is their local revenue, and part of that income is the state aid revenue.
So do you have a breakdown of what each count, what we would like to see is the breakdown of every college, how much of it is mill levy and how much of it is state aid to reach those numbers?
Mr. Chairman, we can do that. That is all identified within the funding allocation model.
I realize it's identified, but to see the actual breakdown, I think would be more of a useful data point.
We can do that.
Okay, what you want to run to the slides now, Larry? Is that your thinking?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The next handout that you have, 5-04, I believe it is. And I think Mr. Swank has given me the authority to share my screen, so I'll do that just so that everybody can see what we're talking about. So what that handout shows, everybody see it? This is a one-pager. It shows what the mill levy collections are for each one of the colleges for fiscal 19. So as I think Senator Landon already asked, just the 7 community college districts, those counties that have a resident community college, they tax their population, property taxes, and they collect 4 mills for a mandatory collection as per statute, And then the board has the option to exercise an additional mill. And in all 7 counties, that is being exercised. So this shows you what those collections are right here. Sorry, in this column right here. There's been previous discussions, and there's probably some current discussion about taxing the other 16 counties. All this is doing is giving you a perspective of what the valuation of those 16 counties is and what a 1 mill equivalent collection could be if it was levied within those 16 counties. So the system would get about $15 million more for each mill assessed to those counties. It's just a representation, just so that you know what that is. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Questions? Go ahead, Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if you look at that, and it's about $14 million for 1 mill. Would there be a way that you would equalize that as well around the state if you did a 1 mill? I'm just thinking out loud. You do it for the 4 mills, but I don't know if that even if we consider doing that, that might be something, Mr. Co-Chair, that I don't know how you would do that. It gets more complicated than not. So, but it would probably be part of the formula. If you rolled it in, you did a statewide mill levy, that you would hold harmless, or, you know, to be able to take care of that and properly spread it across the state in a way that was fair. But that's another discussion if we even consider that down the road.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, I agree that it would probably be best handled mechanically through the funding allocation model to ensure equity across the state in that case. The complexities really arise when we talk about taxation and representation. I think that if you were going to tax those other 16 counties, they would be do some representation on the college board for the service area that they are in, possibly. So that would have to be part of the discussion as well. That is true when we talk annexation, which is a subject later on down the agenda. If a college were to annex, that's provided for in statute that that county would get board representation based on its population as a proportion of the total board of 7 members for each district. So that would be something that would have to come into the conversation as well, I believe. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
We got a couple more questions. Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A 1 mill was considered 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. I've lost track, but one of the big things came up is what's representation? Is it according to how much money that you put into the pot? How much money you spent for the existing schools that build the buildings and have been taxing for like Western's experience for 60 years. And that's when things got really kind of complicated, and that's when the ball was dropped on whether or not that you have a statewide mill levy. The other thing that comes up is that you have the 7 community colleges that have built dorms to where that they're allowing students to come in from their service area to attend the different schools that are there. And I think it's becoming a political issue within the resident counties of why do we tax ourselves to build dorms for service area students that don't that don't contribute anything. And then they start to say, well, the state's giving you money, so don't bring this up. It's a very complicated issue. It's a very emotional issue. we had one county that says we're paying a whole lot more money in taxes already than what you're doing in your county. So we should have more representation on the board. So it became murky very quickly and emotional, just to give you a brief history of where we were at before.
Representative Walters.
I'm good. I had my question answered. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, Larry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next slide or the next handout that you have just gives you a very high level overview of community college tuition and the change that has taken place in that tuition rate over the last 30 years. It's just a snapshot of 1990 versus the current academic year. So I know I think either you or Senator Bebout asked for a much broader, longer history of this, and I do have that. When Mr. Swank asks for that, I'll be ready to provide it. But this just gives you that high-level snapshot that community college tuition has gone from $20 a credit hour up to what is now $99 a credit hour in the state of Wyoming. And it gives you that comparison of Wyoming to the United States average so that you know where we are on the playing field. So
how is the average calculated? In other words, is this real apples to apples? Is it just community colleges across the United States, private versus public?
Mr. Chairman, this is a portrayal of just two-year institutions that are public across the United States.
Okay, questions? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Caldwell.
Great. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I am going to share my screen, if I can find the right one. I wanted to just mention very quickly, and it should be coming up on your screen right now, related to how the commission makes its budget requests moving forward. Within the statutes, it's very clear that the commission is to establish statewide priorities. And they have moved to do that explicitly over the last couple of years and tied that very directly to the statewide college system strategic plan. So as the commission is planning to address its tentative budget, which it does in June, we do a workshop in April. They give us direction on those priorities. They hear the tentative budget in June, and we, in fact, will have a special meeting in August, later at the very end of this month, to adopt that final supplemental budget that is required. So I wanted you to see a sense of the commissioners in them taking their role very seriously and how that informs the budget request in the first place. So when we did the state of the agency in this last budget request, we made sure to tie it to the requirements of the commission, the priorities that they set, and how that is reflected in the statewide college system strategic plan. So these are the priorities that the commissioners established this year. And what I also included was for the last 2 years, where they were very expressly making this very clear as to why the budget requests were coming forward. Educational attainment has been a long issue for the state of Wyoming, and you as the legislature did, in fact, codify that and task the commission with moving that effort forward in a collaborative process with the Educational Attainment Council. So that's right up there. Right combined with that is this, what we call the student transfer success process. I believe Dr. Moritz is going to talk about that in just a moment. more commonly referred to as the common transcript, but it's really about the student, and we wanted the students in that. And then the statewide longitudinal educational data system. So these are things that you enacted as a legislature that the commission felt very strongly when you set that priority, then they should be moving forward with that within the budget request and what we have focused on. And the next is the statewide college system strategic plan. And we did report on that. It had not really been expressly reported very directly in the last few years, and we took that opportunity to do that. The commission does anticipate adopting the new statewide college system strategic plan in October. It got slowed down a little bit due to this thing you may have heard of, COVID-19. So they did not adopt at the June meeting. They do plan to do that at the October meeting. And it very clearly has educational attainment, program alignment, workforce development, and system efficiency in that plan. It is very directly aligned with the post-secondary educational attainment plan, which is the #1 priority. The next one is the Community College Sustainable Funding and Higher Education Governance that the Joint Appropriations requested, the Joint Appropriations Committee requested the Community College Commission move forward, and they wanted that reflected because they were tasked with that. They took it very seriously, and as you heard Mr. Swank, they adopted the charge, and we have that on here later, but they put that as a priority because you asked them to. And then a collaboration among the partners. This is something that has really faced all of us within the impacts of a global pandemic. Working with our other education partners, that was a part of the education task force that was chaired by Superintendent Balo, worked very closely in putting in the request and trying to help the colleges as much as possible reopen, and to ensure that there was support for students, as we do see. The spring semester was not as impacted by COVID-19. It was very impacted, I want to say that, because the colleges all moved to online. But what we're seeing is this concern for the gap year in this fall semester and trying to support that. Of course, the relationship building with the executive branch, the legislative branch, the trustees, the colleges, the president's probably hear from me more than they want to, but they do. And then other stakeholders, because it's so important for our state. As good Senator Bebout mentioned, the importance of the community colleges to the state of Wyoming, and making sure, I think many of you see my face a lot in committee meetings, and that's part of it. Explore additional opportunities for grant funding. I am pleased to say that in collaboration, the Attainment Council and the SLEDS body, which is a very robust governance structure with the statewide longitudinal educational data system, we did apply for a grant, and we were awarded that grant. And the National Center for Education Statistics noted the strength of the Wyoming application for the SLEDS grant, $3.2 million. And I think I saw an email today, and we did apply, or we will imminently apply. I think it's going in today, or may have already, an additional $400,000 to see the impacts on learning and ultimately the workforce related to COVID-19. So we've added an add-on. And then organizational operations, function, efficiency, capacity, those things that we're really putting forward in our state of the agency to make sure it's clear. So I wanted you to see that, because that really does form the basis of where and why the commission moves forward its budget request, and it will also help frame part of the conversation that Dr. Moritz is going to share. So I just wanted to bring that up with everybody to be clear that the commission does take that role seriously, and what you put forward in statute, they move forward into the request in the areas of focus that they have us work on.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that? All right, what's next?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that will be Dr. Moritz. He put a very comprehensive summary together a whole lot of information in a very short summary. So if I may, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Moritz, and he can talk about the courses enrollment, the activities around the student transfer success and common course numbering system, and really the collaboration that's going on among the colleges and actually in coordination with the university as well. So Dr. Moritz.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me. And please, this probably goes without saying, but please feel free to interrupt with questions at any point. I would start by just doing a brief overview of how the programs, the academic programs, are chosen at the colleges. There's a great deal of alignment that goes on. The commission is responsible for approving all new credit-bearing programs at the colleges, whether that be a short-term certificate or a academic degree program, associate's level, or now the Bachelor of Applied Science level. When you look through the white paper that Mr. Swank had put together, you'll notice that the various reports and studies over the past 35 years have consistently pointed to the need for that kind of alignment. And the legislative actions that have followed have moved us closer and closer to where we are now. And right now we do have a very robust system for reviewing those. So if a college wants to begin a new program, that starts within the college itself. It starts with the faculty who are closest to those specializations. And the college itself, their processes vary, but what unites them is looking at the economic need in their area for those programs, and then ensuring that the academic, that they have the right academic strengths, and that the students are coming out of those programs with the competencies that they need to succeed in those areas. So once it has moved through that process, it comes to the commission, and we review it at multiple levels. We have a program review committee that's internal. We review those to ensure that all of the information that we require has been submitted properly, that the applications are in order. Then that moves on to the Academic Affairs Council, which has representatives of the vice presidents of academic affairs from all 7 colleges, as well as myself. They review that to ensure that, again, does it meet economic needs? Can you point to ONET, or can you point to Next Gen Sector Partnerships as a validated need for that program? And then is the curriculum strong? Does the layout of the coursework make sense? These are experts in curriculum, and so they have very, they really discuss these in great detail. If approved, it then moves on to the Executive Council, which is the presidents of the colleges, and they're asking very similar questions. If it's approved there, then it goes on to the commission itself at one of our regular meetings, and the commissioners review those, and sometimes frequently are asking very similar questions. So there's a lot of perhaps redundancy, but it's really important that stakeholders at different levels of the colleges and the commission have that chance to review and make sure that we are not duplicating resources. And I believe Dr. Caldwell and Mr. Buchholz earlier talked about duplication and replication. Replicating programs that serve the needs of different community college service areas, that's important. And examples might be a business program, or it might be a welding program. It might be nursing. These are all areas that have high demand, that all of the service areas have a demonstrated need. And because the community colleges, as Dr. Tyndall noted earlier, are not working with the same populations. A lot of our populations are place-bound. It is important that those are replicated so they can take advantage of that. but what we want to avoid is duplication. I think a good example of that might be Eastern's gunsmithing program. It's an excellent program, but there are not that many gunsmithing programs across the entire country. And if they find a great deal of success, that doesn't mean that we want to replicate that or duplicate that, sorry, across the other colleges. They would be competing with each other for a very confined set of students. So that's really the balancing act that we utilize. And then in the report that I submitted to the LSO, you can also see that there is an ongoing process by which we constantly review the programs that are going on at the colleges and ensure that they continue to have strong enrollment, that they continue to serve the needs of the community. And the colleges do this as well. The colleges, because of the limited funding that they have no interest in running a program that has minimal enrollments. If it costs more to offer a program than the tuition that's coming in, it's very difficult to make the argument to maintain that. And so they regularly reduce or eliminate programs as well if they no longer see that their communities are being well served. So there's a table in that paper that looks at the number of discontinued programs statewide year to year. And you might be surprised at how high that is. You always hear about new programs coming in, but you don't hear about those being retired. So 2015, 2016, there were 39 discontinued programs. The next year there were 40, the next year there were 60. Last year was a little bit lower number, it was 16. And there's always other reasons around those. But I think it is indicative of the fact that the colleges and the commission have a robust process for reviewing the continued usefulness and utility of those programs. We also have mandated a 5-year review program ourselves.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Senator Biba.
Thank you, Mr. Just a quick question. When you look at that 4 criteria for the 4-tiered approval process, when we look at trying to consolidate budget reductions, seems to me that you really don't need 1 and 2, that you could do just 3 and 4 become 1 and 2. Has there been any discussion about that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, thank you for that question. You're referring to the Program Review Committee as number 1 and the Academic Affairs Council as number 2?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I am.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, thank you. That could be something that is discussed. My initial reaction to that is that the Academic Affairs Council in particular brings a specific skill set that perhaps the Executive Council does not. One of the primary roles of these approval processes, as I said, is not only the alignment with community needs and economic needs, but also the curricular integrity of those programs. And the vice presidents of academic affairs live and breathe that curriculum. Presidents are also very well aware of what makes a good program, but not being in the trenches on a day-to-day basis, they may not. However, having said that, we can definitely look at opportunities for efficiencies as far as that process is concerned.
So Ben, typically, how long does this process take to go through this? And so when does a community college have to begin the process to have it come out the other end? And then my second question is, how often does this review process result in a denial of a particular class that a college wants? And then is there a reconciliation, or is there what's that process?
Mr. Chairman, that's an excellent question. The time period varies according to the college in question. Once it has been approved by the college and comes to the commission, we can usually do this relatively quickly. I would say if they time it well, it could be as much as as little as 3 or 4 weeks if they are choosing a AAC meeting that occurs very shortly before a regularly scheduled commission meeting. Because the commission meetings are 4 to 6, sometimes more with special meetings times a year, you could get your request in right after a meeting had just occurred. But we're looking in the generally 1 to 3 month range. What takes more time is the curricular committee meeting schedule at the colleges themselves. Some of them will only meet 4 times a year. Some of them will meet on a rolling basis. And then when it comes through the commission and is approved, the colleges also have different timings as far as how much lead time they need to put that into their catalog and get advertising out. So we had been working with one at LCCC. I see Dr. Schaefer is on, so I'll call you out. That because of the time to get it into the catalog, getting a program approved by the commission early this summer would not have been sufficient to prepare it for this fall. And so you're looking at a little more lead time. So, you know, a lot of these timing things come up. I'm now trying to think of the follow-up question about programs that are turned down. Frequently, the proposals have been so well vetted through the colleges that by the time they get to the AAC, they're very solid. I would also like to commend the vice presidents of academic affairs for their collaboration on an ongoing basis. So for example, a program came through from Eastern. Before it even came to the AAC, the VP of academic affairs there had reached out to her fellow VPs at the other colleges to get feedback, to understand, you know, what are you seeing on ONET? What do you think of this curriculum? You have a similar program at your college. So it is unlikely for them to come through and get turned down. However, when that does happen, usually the guidance from the AAC is very constructive, and suggestions are made for how it could be made acceptable, and then they're encouraged to bring it back to the next AAC meeting. So we have those at least once a month, so that would only bump it back by about a month. Does that address your questions?
Do you keep data or statistics on how long every request takes and what the turnaround time is, and also you keep any data on complaints or disagreements that you have with the individual colleges on particular programs?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Nicholas, we do not collect that data per se. However, it would be relatively straightforward to collect that. The only issue might be identifying a true start date at the college. That would be a definitional question that we would have to align with those colleges. For instance, if a faculty member during a department meeting says, I would like to start this program, what do you all think? Whether that is the starting point or whether the starting point is when an official form is submitted to their academic affairs committee. But we could compile that if you would like to see it.
Okay, any other questions for Ben? Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ben, thank you for the information. Specific to the program elimination chart, and related to our discussion throughout the morning, I'm just sitting here wondering if we indeed have to execute another 10% on top of the 10% cut that the colleges are already undergoing. I'm sitting here thinking about what kinds of programs are going to be on the bubble. And in my experience, programs like engineering and physics and high-level accounting, you know, the list could get fairly long, but I guess I'd be interested in your 30,000-foot view of concerns related to what programs the presidents might be forced to eliminate at the colleges, and whether or not that might lead to a spiral down in enrollment, for example. Can you paint that picture a little bit for us?
Yes, Senator Landon, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. First of all, I would just like to recognize that those decisions, how those cuts are made made at the college level, and the presidents and the VPs of academic affairs have had some very difficult decisions they've had to make, and most likely will continue to have to make those difficult decisions. I can speculate as to some of the criteria that they would need to use. You mentioned engineering and chemistry and higher level accounting programs. It's interesting that when cuts are made, it cannot simply be, let's look for low enrollment, cross-reference that with the cost of the faculty that we're paying, add up the capital that goes into those classrooms, and you come up with a ranking. When you mentioned chemistry, for example, getting an associate's degree in chemistry to prepare you to transfer to UW and other four-year colleges and universities requires a combination of 1,000 and 2,000 level courses. Those 1,000 level courses are also required for perhaps a dozen or more other programs. And so you would not be necessarily eliminating all of the chemistry faculty if you remove that chemistry program. However, only students who were enrolled in that associate's degree in chemistry would be taking the 2,000 level courses. So do you have faculty that are only teaching 2,000 level versus 2,000 and 1,000 level? That it's a very complex formula. And I know that the VPs of academics are in frequent discussion about what types of sorting, what types of evaluation analysis are most effective in finding those programs to cut, because it can be very difficult. If you cut a journalism program, for example, and some journalism programs over the last few years have been cut, and one of the reasons is that there is less 1,000 level general studies type courses taught by those instructors than math or communications or some of these other ones. And so you have to look at how that's going to impact everything. But you also mentioned a spiral down. And I think that spiral down starts to occur when you simply don't have the funding to cover all of the bare minimums required by accreditation. You need to have a financial aid officer. You need to have curriculum that meets HLC requirements. And that means you need to have English courses, and you need to have math courses, and you need to have humanities courses, and et cetera, et cetera. Some of the colleges, when they're thinking about making these cuts, are going beyond the point of, well, I'd really like to keep this program, and I'd really like to keep this program, but are starting to get to the level of, we need all X number of these faculty so that we can offer these accredited requirements to continue offering anything. So that's a lot of for examples and a lot of abstraction, because every college is going to face its own challenges. But hopefully that's somewhat helpful and at least alludes to the complexity of the issue and the challenge that all of the colleges face in their own ways.
Mr. Chairman, it does. And, I didn't even bring up the very high cost, low enrollment programs, ironically, that have been really the focal point of our discussions in higher education, have centered around trade and industry type programs, to try to train workforces. And those are going to be tough decisions too, given the fact that you have a low enrollment and very high costs. So thanks for your thoughts on that, Ben. I appreciate it.
Senator Bebo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we talk about these reductions that the co-chairman brought up, the 10%, or actually Senator Lander brought them up, but we've all been thinking about them, 10%, maybe another 10%. And I realize and understand that the local college presidents make those decisions with their own individual boards. But it seems to me that if we look at this and we have to make these kind of reductions, I guess I would ask Sandy, how does the commission, and in your role, how do you anticipate the colleges trying to work together? So we're all very cognizant of the importance of having career tech and doing the things that community colleges do, but this might be a time where, for whatever reason, one particular course, I know LCCC has got some great things they do in radiology and other areas, maybe, up there at Northwest, they might do welding somewhere, so that you might look at, there's ways to, instead of everybody trying to do all of them, some might take the lead and do specific ones. How do you see that playing out?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Bebout, when we so first off, I will tell you, I do meet regularly with the presidents, with our executive council. And I think that's an important thing to note when we are talking about these very serious conversations that we're having around budget reductions. In the face of what we're talking about in terms of the state aid, also included things like the health insurance. And they have to figure out how they're going to manage that cut, which we actually have determined in that process and rules. If there's a shortfall that has to come out of their funding structure in some way, they've got to cover it, or they have to determine how they're going to cut. How the individual colleges manage that cut, because once we do that cut, the balance of the funding does go out through the allocation model, and that is then either unrestricted funding, or it's restricted to the line items of health insurance and retirement contributions and those sorts of things. How the colleges talk about that is trying to meet their local needs. They have their advisory councils, and we do have this new opportunity that we've not ever had before, and that is the ability to work in consortiums. So it's not a one size thing. I'm going to be very clear on that. But we do leave that to the individual colleges and their boards, because that is a local board decision once that funding comes to them. And that's not expressly provided for by the commission. So therefore, it must be left to the purview of the colleges. So we don't tell them how to do that. We do not. But they have to make those challenging decisions. And that is not a simple topic at all. They have advisory councils. They have very unique programs, for example, in their colleges for how they manage that. And if I may, Senator Bebout, we ask for what they're doing, and sometimes they're in the midst of trying to figure that out. I never want to get ahead of them and their boards. So perhaps Dr. Schaefer or Dr. Tyndall might be able to share what that experience is what that is like for them once we've had this conversation about this is what it's going to look like, and this is what it's going to look like for the total impact for your college. And then they have to then take that back to their own college to determine how they're going to put that together. So of course, it's the pleasure of the chairman, but deferring that to what that is actually like at the college might be better for Dr. Schaefer or Dr. Tyndall.
And I get that. And before they answer that question, it seems to me though that you have the local boards may just have a strong feeling about having one program, and you got 6 boards all have that same strong feeling. And given what we're going through right now, that's just not going to work. So I guess I'd be interested in the comments of either Dr. Schaefer or Dr. Tyndall, what they think. But clearly we just can't be like we have been in the past, where we have trying to be all for everyone everywhere.
So someone's got their, is not muted, because we're hearing a little background chatter. Go ahead and respond. Yeah. Brad?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, at the last president's meeting or so, maybe Joe can help me remember, but we did discuss about we need to help each other. In certain programs, engineering, for example, you have classes where you get low enrollments, and you get, same thing could be said for calculus 3. And some of these, you could easily say, hey, take someone else's online class And those are relatively easy, but unfortunately, a lot of it is not easy. And so what happens, I think, is what distinguishes each college is the specialty program. So at Central, we had this startup intensive, which we were so proud about. We were bragging about it the last 2 or 3 years. And we cut that program with the first 10% cut because we do have to do the calculations, and a lot of it, you know, you're looking into your crystal ball and trying to think if you can turn it around quickly. And we were partnering with UW to do so, but you kind of run out of time. As the financial crunch happens, you say, you know what, I think the state needs entrepreneurship. You know, we need more small businesses. We need more reason for people to stay in their small towns. We know we need to diversify the economy, made all the strategic sense in the world. But at the end of the day, it was losing too much money. And we said, gosh, this is just a crying shame. So I think what we see in our case is that with these cuts, oftentimes we have to cut things which had promise and had strategic importance for the state, but the dollars just say we have to cut it. And so what's easy to keep is chemistry and English and math and things that transfer. They're kind of our cash cows, if you will. But it's the thing that often has strategic importance. For example, you know, ag in Fremont County, it's very, very big potential in terms of economic development, but you don't get tons and tons of ag students. You get tons and tons of English, you know, and remedial math and that kind of things. So unfortunately, I think these cuts are putting pressure on us to cut important specialty programs. And so we hustle to try to get grants to support that. But that's a very iffy proposition. But I do think we recognize as presidents that we're going to have to see what we can do more so in terms of kind of sending people elsewhere. But I'd like to say that there's a ton of that already. We live and die by the budget. And so we do not have at Central a physical therapy program or occupational therapy because the numbers would be too small and we can't have that many loss leaders. So we send them all to Casper. There's a ton of programs that we say, you know what, they have diesel at Western. We don't even try to do diesel. We don't do a bunch of medical programs. We send them elsewhere. If they need to do something kind of big in terms of machining and whatnot, LCCC and Northern. And so there's a whole lot of that already. And of course, there's a lot of frustration because people will come to us and say, how come you don't have more in terms of computer programming? And we're thinking, because it's just too much of a loss. And I think we address that frustration on a regular basis. So that's pretty much our world. We only can afford a couple lost programs for strategic reasons that we're trying to develop. And those opportunities are going to go down a lot in the future, it looks like, especially if, you know, with more cuts coming our way. So I don't know if Joe can answer that better, but Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, there's my 2 bits.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, thanks. Joe Schaefer with Laramie County Community College. I've really been appreciative of being part of the dialogue and listening today. So a lot to unpack there in terms of answering that question. I guess one of the first things I would throw out there that's maybe just a bit off topic is that we often talk about the financial savings through efficiency by our academic programming. Instructional expenditures actually make up the minority of the college's budget expenditures. The slight minority, I want to say that it's roughly, if I remember last I looked at it, I want to say that about 48% of all of our expenditures are instructional, whereas 52% are that fixed piece. And so I share that because it is things other than the variables of what we offer programmatically that also drive a significant expense, part of our portfolio. From a programmatic perspective, this is where it gets a little bit challenging. And I guess the first thing that I would share is that oftentimes community colleges represent who's governing them and represent the uniqueness of the community that they serve. In many states, the governance, the direction for community colleges follows who's got the most skin in the game, but not always. And I think Wyoming is one of those that you could argue doesn't necessarily work that way. But the colleges are reflective of really the economic and community makeup that we have. In LCCC, we have got a strong healthcare sector, especially with the Front Range, and so naturally our programming in healthcare is strong. In Gillette, you see it with the mining and the mineral industry. And so we tend to be reflective that way. There's been a lot of conversation historically that we should create these quote unquote centers of excellence, and that XYZ college should really do this and should really do that. And I think there's some merit to doing that when it makes sense for the state or for the region that the community college serves. Here's where it gets problematic though, and that's the populations we serve. And so at times, it is just not feasible for us to tell an adult single parent, with kids, that, hey, appreciate that you really want this program, Riverton is the place to do it. You need to go there. If the CWC can deliver it remotely, I think that's great, from an online perspective, but oftentimes we just simply can't take place committed or place bound individuals and redirect them to other community colleges. This becomes incredibly important when we realize that those populations, first generation adults, single parents, those people, they consume a significant amount of non-academic services that they want to access in their local community. And so there's a population, and arguably the population we need to engage more of, adults, are ones that are going to require a local proximate access to services and to programs. And I think that's a challenge. I'll be the first to tell you that this issue of duplication and replication, you've heard it come up multiple times now. I think Representative Freeman talked about, being on the table years ago. I have yet to come across a policy in the state of Wyoming that defines duplication, defines replication, defines when it's okay or when it's good, defines when it shouldn't be good. And as a result, there isn't motivation, I would say, for higher education or education in general to do anything other than to respond with their own program when the demand's there and the needs are there. And so I think that is something that probably needs to be explored. There are great reasons to duplicate or replicate, as Dr. Merritt said, programs. But there may be reasons not to do that as well. And I would say that it's a pretty fluid and undefined playing field that we try to navigate those conversations right now. And then the last thing, I think Dr. Tyndall really had a great point that he made here with these cuts. So yeah, we have to look at which programs we want to reduce and we want to take off the table. In some ways, what business do we want to get out of? And each round we continue to do this. Here's the challenge we're running into is that 10% or 20% cuts, most of us are saying, how do we get there? The reality is we not only need to get there, but we need to think about what is it going to take to start putting the programs on the table that Wyoming needs for its future. So we're attriting and holding up, but when the time we should actually be investing in loss leaders like manufacturing-based programs, financial tech programs, those types of services that align with an economic diversification goal. I can tell you we're not able to do that right now because one, there isn't the students immediately there. Two, there isn't the support there. So what we're going to have if we just continue down the path we're down is basically this shriveled up workforce development, economic development system that's your community colleges that's done everything it could just to keep doing what they're doing. And by looking at those things that have the immediate return, and those are your general education courses and some of these high demand programs. And so I share that because those are the challenges we have to think about. But my worry is as we go through all of this, what happens when we come out of it in the community colleges is you have a system that now is dropped back to where it was in the 90s instead of thinking about where we need to be in the 2030s. And Wyoming's economy will benefit or break based on what we do as we think about this. And so it's a challenge we have. And ultimately what I would say is these colleges are designed to respond to the direction that they're given. And right now that predominantly happens at the local level. If there needs to be a greater direction and a greater clarity in their mission and purpose from the state level, then we need to define that through strategic planning, governance legislation. But I would tell you that I don't think that specificity is there, nor are the resources to actually do what it is I think you want from us in the future. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'll get off my soapbox a little bit there. There's a lot to talk about and certainly lots of things I'm passionate about, but the fact that you're taking the time to engage in this conversation is fantastic.
So just to follow up on that, how are the Community College Commission and the colleges working on the duplication issues, particularly with remote learning? Because if you're all offering the same online courses that are basically the same course, it seems to me that's the logical place that you can refine costs and expenses, but still offer a curriculum with less on the ground expenses. So are you engaged in those conversations? Where are we at with them?
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll answer. I'm sure Dr. Caldwell wants to chime in too, but so I'll give you two examples. I think in certain cases, the colleges are cognizant of the resource limitations and willing to reach out. A good example is our partnership with Casper College for our surgical technology program. The hospital there really needed scrub techs, surge techs. Casper College recognized it either wasn't something they were interested in or able to do. And after industry reached out to us, we entered into a partnership that essentially allows students to earn their prerequisite general education courses for Casper College. Then they enroll in our surgical technology program to complete. And we've earmarked spots in that program specifically for Natrona County students or Casper College students, if you will. So there's instances where that works. What I find, and I could be, Dr. Tyndall may want to share something different though, is there tends to be more of an unwritten agreement that we don't push the button about whether or not one college can provide a program effectively in another community college's district. And I'll share an example of a college president that's no longer here. When they opted to advance a program basically in human services and to deliver a program with a proposal that would be completely online. LCCC had an online program at the time, and we extended the opportunity to basically deliver it to their community. And the response was essentially, no, thank you. We want to serve our own students. And so right now, I would say, at least from our perspective, it's very informal, even though some of the forms of the processes ask us about, what other colleges offer these programs. But generally, the word on the street is, if you want a program to go through, let's not contest my program and let us do our own thing.
And
Go ahead,
Mr.
Ben. Sorry, I saw him first.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to add to that, in the process that we have now, there are specific questions in the forums and in the discussion that are mandatory, where does this program exist at other colleges? If so, have you talked with those other colleges? How have you established that this is necessary at your college if it's already existing someplace else? So that's an important piece. And also, Dr. Caldwell earlier pointed out the various forms of higher education commissions and groups and at the state level. And one of the advantages, in my opinion, with a coordinating body such as ours, is that we are there to facilitate and to encourage the discussions amongst the colleges. That facilitation, rather than mandating and governing, allows us to bring together the colleges, whether that's the VPs of academic affairs or the presidents or the financial aid people, and say, here's our marching orders from the state. We need to get this done. We need to get this done. Let's work together and figure out how we can do this, knowing that none of us have exorbitant budgets. We're all tracking pennies. And so the motivation to consolidate, to collaborate, I think is very strong. And it's only increasing, not only because of budgets becoming tighter, but also, again, to point out to the historical trend of all of the reports and studies that have been done to improve the community colleges. there is more and more facilitation, there is more and more communication, and as a result, I believe there is more and more cooperative programs. Just to mention a few, the Renew program, working with not just the colleges, but the university as well. The new CTE teacher ed program, which stretches across all 8 institutions. There are med tech programs and dental hygiene programs that have been aligned with UW curriculum, and not all the colleges offer them, but some do. And then also with the recent Wyoming Works programs to allow for the CDL program that travels across the state, and several others that are being discussed now. So, you know, if any of you would have the chance to sit in on one of the Academic Affairs Council meetings, you know, of the 90 minutes that we meet every 2 or 3 weeks, I would say at least half of it was spent discussing shared concerns and curricular ideas. It's kind of a brainstorming session to some extent. I mean, we still have to get through all of the business, but you know, I've been in several different states and in a variety of roles, but working with colleges 2-year and 4-year. And I don't think that I've seen this level of collaboration and cooperation before, but I'm now getting into my opinion and probably beyond the scope of this question.
Okay, Sandy, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to add 2 things. One specific, both of these specific to, I believe, questions that Senator Bebout asked. One was about the cuts, and one thing to note about the colleges, whenever they cut within their colleges, they do have specific limitations on what they can do related to programs, instructional programs. They do have requirements of what is called teach out. Colleges very frequently, when they know they're going to be eliminating a program, that is not a simple effort that happens in that moment. They have to figure out how they're going to sunset that program in order to make sure that the students that are in the pipeline are completed. And that's an accreditation requirement. They cannot get around that. So they, how things might happen for them ultimately in 2 years where they might make the cut might not be how they have to begin that process when the cuts are handed down. I had to acknowledge that because it's not a clean aspect when it comes to an instructional program. The second point that I wanted to make was also something brought up by Senator Bebout that Dr. Moritz alluded to, and that was in that 4-step process for how something gets approved. I think you can see why the first 2 steps are so critically important. That's where the heavy lifting has to happen. We want to make sure that we resolve any problems or stop something before it ever comes to the presidents or the commission. We want to make sure that that's thoroughly done. Within that is determining the level of instruction that needs to be done before it comes forward, how it's going to fit in the Common Course numbering system, and where it will fit in articulation. We want those things to make sure that they're happening on the front end instead of something moving through and then trying to figure out how we're going to fix it afterwards. So those first 2 steps are pretty heavy lifting. And then on the cuts, the colleges have some obligations that they have to uphold when that happens. So that's it. That's all I had, Chairman.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 comments. I'm going to try to make this quick. One is you asked about kind of coordination of online classes, and we have quick answer, why class? There's a website. So just in terms of that coordination, that's already there. So if someone wants to take a class online, they can, anywhere within our system, they just go to Y class, and UW is also mentioned on there as well. So that's a major coordinating thing that we have. The second comment I want to say is, as an economist, I believe in capitalism. And I think what we have is academic capitalism, and this little bit of competition, as Representative Freeman mentioned, I think, frankly, by and large, is working really, really well. If things do not pencil out for me because another college is doing it really, really well, and it's a high yield, put it this way, really, really good jobs and really, really good salary programs, you will see higher percentage of people who will figure out how to move. Yes, our students are largely place bound, but if the value added degree like occupational and physical therapy is good enough, I actually know the family, friends of the family that actually picked up and moved from Riverton after they took the gen ed here and went there to finish up. And so there's this kind of this academic capitalism thing where if I can make and pencil out welding, because one, people aren't going to move for a welding certificate to learn how to do, just stick welding, that's it. They're not going to move anywhere. Then the capitalism, the free market of that is, it does pencil out for me. And I do offer that program. And so much of this, and I don't offer crazy programs that just won't pencil out because the economics of it just doesn't work. And so I think so much of what works for us is because of that competition piece, where it's not crazy competition where we're all losing money. But if things pencil out for you to do welding locally, there's a need locally. There's a market locally, and we do welding locally. If something else is, a program like we heard with, gunsmithing, not a whole lot of revenue there, just a limited market. So I'd argue that what I have found, what works in Wyoming, is we have a very much kind of academic capitalism approach that I think by and large is working for us.
Great, appreciate it. Okay, where are we at in terms of the?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Representative Greer.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right time, but I need a bit of a refresher on who pays for and how the funding goes with, I think it's called the concurrent enrollment with the students that are in the high school. How does that money flow? Who gets the credit for it? How's that, before we move on? And we're talking about current college governance and funding. Isn't that a significant portion of it?
Who wants to jump in first? Ben?
Yes, Representative Greer, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. It is a complicated process, to be frank. The POP program, the Post-Secondary Educational Opportunity Program, requires that students have the ability to take up to 12 credits of dual or concurrent enrollment, meaning they're taking college level courses while they're in high school. The intent of that program is to encourage post-secondary completion, and statistics show, not only in Wyoming, but across the state or across the country, that students who engage with those types of programs do have higher completion rates and do go on to college. So it's very valuable, especially for students who are disproportionately less likely to go on to college, those with less family income or other underrepresented groups. Having said that, as the statute is now, it does not describe an actual funding method. So that is largely between the colleges and the high schools, and in some cases the BOCES or BOCHES. Now I know that there's a lot of expertise on this Zoom call right now, folks who work with this on a daily basis, and I've gotten a lot of expertise from talking with them. So when I'm done, I would yield the floor to my colleagues as well.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not questioning the validity of the program. I'm trying to figure out funding. Okay. So my understanding is that students sitting in the classroom at the high school, we're paying for that. The state is paying for that student. Okay. It's my understanding that when we look at House Bill 80 and we look at how we recalibrate for enrollment, that those numbers are included in that as well. Is that correct?
Representative Greer, Mr. Chairman, not always. In some situations where there's a BOCES or a BOCHES, that BOCHES covers the cost of that tuition. So that county, through the BOCHES mill levy, is covering the cost. When a BOCES or BOCHES is not there, then the college and the high school are dealing with those costs. In most cases, that means that the college is scholarshiping or not charging tuition, especially for the dual enrollment course. And the high school, in many cases, is covering the books and transportation. They do still get the FTE the college does for that scholarship student. And so the state is funding that through that allocation model to some extent, but not to the same extent as if that student were paying tuition and they were getting that FTE. Does that address some of your question?
So, Mr. Chairman, it kind of does, but you know, as I understand, so I'm in Warland, where our district doesn't have much of a presence, so most of their efforts are all done in the high school. And in my understanding is these courses are taught by, well, I know this because both my kids went through it, are taught by basically their high school teachers. So I'm just having a hard time. No one's ever really been able to tell me how this specifically works. And so what I come away with is the impression that we're paying twice for, and that's fine. I just got to know how it works and understand it.
Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, thank you. And that's a great question, and I'd be happy to do some clarifying there. There's concurrent enrollment, which is what you're describing, where the high school teachers are teaching college level courses in the high school. For those courses, the high school is, let's see how to explain this. The college is treating that high school instructor as an adjunct instructor. Normally, they would pay a salary to them. Instead, they pass that cost on to the high school. The high school would normally have to pay tuition for those students, and those balance out. And so we're essentially exchanging paper, and no one is held for any cost on that. For the dual enrollment, those dual enrollment courses are when a student, either through online or by traveling to the community college, enrolls in a regularly scheduled community college course. Those are the instances where the community college is scholarshiping those students, and the high school is paying what is left over, if that's books or sometimes fees. And then the student gets the FTE, or the college gets the FTE, but does not get that tuition. So I don't believe that in either instance that anyone is paying twice for them. In some instances, they're paying half.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, Mr. Chairman. So, yeah, and again, I'm a simple guy, so I just wanted to talk about the concurrent enrollment. That was my question. So with the concurrent enrollment, aren't those enrollment numbers included when you do the recalibration? So,
yes.
okay.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I see Larry has his hand up. I'll defer to my CFO.
Go ahead, Larry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Greer. The plain and simple answer is yes. For every successfully completed credit hour delivered in the high school that counts for college credit, those credit hours are included in the enrollment numbers that we use to recalculate and recalibrate the base period. They are included. Likewise, that head count is included as ADM for the high school calculation, the K-12 calculation. So that's where the nature of we're paying twice comes from. It's specifically in statute that they will be included in both calculations, that the colleges will count those credits as being successfully delivered credits, and the colleges or the K-12 system will include them in their ADM.
Okay.
So to follow up on that, how many students are we talking about? How many students are concurrent enrolled on an annual basis across the state? Do we know those numbers?
Mr. Moritz, Dr. Moritz?
Go ahead.
Yes, Representative Nichols. Yes, we do a report on that every year, and I am pulling that up right now. It is a substantial number, and I am bad at multitasking. And so I'll have to pull that number down. Just give me maybe a couple of minutes, but
Sure.
a very high percentage of students in high school are taking advantage of this. And it's across the colleges and the university, and I can get those numbers for you shortly.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not doing this to pick a scab or wounds or anything. I just think it's important that we all understand how this works. You know, and so then, you know, so we've looked at our funding sources, right? So we've got the mills, which are in the counties. Campbell County is an exception, okay? Senator Wasserberger, I understand that. But the mills in the county where the community colleges are located, we got the BOCES, if I'm saying that correctly, in a couple of counties, and state aid tuition. Okay, I just be blunt. I mean, state aid's going to significantly be reduced. What are our other options? Is it a statewide mill levy for every county? Is it something where there's a physical presence? What has been discussed? Because I can't see us continuing at a 70% state aid rate for the community colleges. And I sure don't want to see us go backwards on what we're doing. But what options are out there? We have to have these hard discussions.
Senator Wassenberger, Mr. Co-Chair.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I did want to address the issue of dual enrollment and concurrent enrollment. I asked that question earlier, just as Representative Greer did. And I believe that the co-chair, myself, and Representative Greer served on a task force about 3 years ago on this very issue. But I am the executive director of the Board of Cooperative Higher Education Services, and primarily that is BOCES, and BOCES levies a half mil voted on by the Campbell County School Board of Trustees, and they develop a 3-member board, and that board is the BOCES board, and they hire an executive director. They use that half mil levy on the community of Campbell County, which generates about $2.6 million. We use that money to fund dual enrollment and then also to fund our local community college and Gillette College. We give about $1.9 million to Gillette College in a block grant, and then we implement a dual enrollment program. Dual enrollment is called dual enrollment because a student is both enrolled in both the high school and Gillette College. Dual enrollment means that they attend Gillette College. They do not take a course in their local high school. Those courses taken at a local high school are called concurrent enrollment. Okay, and how it essentially works is we pay not only Gillette College for that student, but also Campbell County School District for that student. Gillette College receives for every 12 credit hours of a student taking dual enrollment courses an FTE, which is a part of their enrollment funding. And then the $17,000 that we pay to Campbell County School District for a student, or whatever the average is now, they're still paid that amount. The purpose of the program was started way back in 1995. And the reason why I know that, because that was the very first year I was in the Wyoming legislature in the House side, and the bill was carried by at that time, Representative Jim Hageman. The purpose of the program is to promote students taking college courses and increase those students in being successful at the collegiate level. Right now, my program has about 125 students taking courses that I pay for to Gillette College. And so it's been a very successful program, a program that has been in place for almost 30 years now. So that's how the system works. I think, I hope I have that correct for Dr. Moritz and Dr. Tyndall. So I believe that's the simple explanation of how it works. And it's been around for a long, long time.
Representative Freeman.
just to add a little bit of what's been said, Wyoming does dual and concurrent enrollment probably better than 47 other states. NACEP, which is the organization for concurrent enrollment, has announced at the last 2 meetings that I have been at that Wyoming is one of 3 states that 50% of their high school graduates have at least some college credit when they graduate. There's bumps and bruises in our system that have to be addressed at some point, but we do give students the head start to go forward, and it does help, particularly first generation college students to get forward. And to reiterate what Representative backwards on this, but we have to have a pretty good understanding of where our bumps and bruises are and smooth them out.
Okay, Senator Wassenberger, one more time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And just lastly, the concurrent enrollment piece. Several years ago, to get those courses. And so every teacher that teaches a concurrent enrollment course in the state of Wyoming by now has to be certified by the local community college based on the federal act that was passed just a few years ago. And I just wanted to throw that in there. I'm sorry.
Okay, Representative Greer.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. I know we're going to break for lunch here, and I've got work to do over the lunch hour. And I'm just looking at our agenda, and this part of the agenda was funding, and I'm looking for ideas on funding. I'm not questioning. I think concurrent enrollment's great. I understand the program's dual and concurrent enrollment. Good job. Everybody's done a great job. How are we going to pay for it tomorrow? That's why I'm on this task force. That's why I'm taking this time out of a very busy month to be on here. How are we going to do it? Are we going to have that discussion or
Yeah, I think we were heading down that road after lunch, basically.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm just holding your feet to the fire. I'm sorry.
Good. I like it. All right. Sandy, before we break for lunch.
Mr. Chairman, we do have total numbers that Representative Greer asked. In the last year, concurrent enrollment had 5,700 students, we're rounding right here, and dual enrollment had 2,855.
So with combined dual and concurrent, that's roughly 8,000 students, 8,300 students, right?
Yes, sir.
Out of a 26,000, 27,000 total enrollment?
Yes, sir, out of almost 29,000, 29,000, yes, sir.
So it's close to a quarter of your students. Ben?
Thank you, Representative Nicholas. And I would just add that because dual and concurrent tends to be at the senior and junior level, it's probably best if you're figuring a proportion to not take it on the entire high school population, but rather the juniors and seniors to whatever extent that's helpful. And there may be replication across dual enrollment and concurrent enrollment, but there is not duplication within each of those numbers themselves.
Yeah, I believe my daughter was doing both concurrent and dual at the same time in Riverton. Okay, it's now what, about 12:15? So we'll break and we'll be back at 1:15. Does that work for everybody? All right. Thank you, everybody.